Hey everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know a lot of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we start, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and just relax. The Kind Woman's Warning. This story was shared with me years ago by someone close to my family. A woman named Nicole who wanted to pass along a piece of wisdom that would stay with me forever. Back in the early 80s, when she was just a young woman in her 20s, Nicole was the type of person who couldn't pass by someone in need without offering help. She was driving that long stretch of highway toward the city, a journey that took about 2 hours from her small town, when she noticed a figure walking along the roadside in the fading afternoon light. As her car approached, the man turned and raised his arm in that universal gesture we all recognize, his thumb pointing hopefully down the road ahead. Nicole's compassionate heart wouldn't let her just drive past, so she pulled over and asked if he needed assistance. The man seemed genuinely grateful and perhaps a little nervous when he asked if she could give him a ride to the city. Without hesitation, she unlocked the passenger door and welcomed him inside, watching as he carefully placed his worn backpack in the rear seat before settling in for the journey. Their conversation flowed naturally as the miles passed beneath the wheels, touching on everyday topics like current events, mutual acquaintances, and the weather that was turning cooler as autumn approached. When they stopped at a rest area about halfway to their destination, Nicole insisted on buying him dinner despite his embarrassed protests about his financial situation. She could see he was struggling with pride and hunger, but eventually he accepted her kindness with quiet gratitude, and they continued their journey with full stomachs and lighter hearts. When they finally reached the city limits and he asked to be let out near the downtown district, he thanked her repeatedly for both the ride and the meal. Before stepping out onto the busy street, he hesitantly asked if he could have her phone number to perhaps repay her kindness someday when his luck improved. Nicole, pleased at the thought of hearing how her new friend would fare, wrote it down on a piece of paper and handed it to him with a warm smile, driving away with that satisfied feeling that comes from helping another human being. The truly disturbing part of this story came exactly 1 week later when Nicole's phone rang late in the evening. The voice on the other end belonged to the hitchhiker, but his words froze her blood as he spoke without letting her interrupt. He told her she should thank whatever God she believed in that she had been raised to show such genuine kindness to strangers. He confessed that when he first got into her car, he had been planning something terrible, intending to assault and murder her at that rest stop, steal her vehicle, and leave her body hidden somewhere along that lonely stretch of highway. But her warmth, her genuine conversation, and especially her generosity in buying him dinner when she didn't have to, had completely changed his mind and made him realize he couldn't harm someone who had shown him such unexpected humanity. His final words before hanging up were a desperate plea that she should never, ever pick up another hitchhiker again because the next one might not have a conscience that could be touched by kindness. When Nicole tried to call back, she reached only a payphone somewhere in the city, and she never heard from him again. The highway encounter. My own experience with picking up a hitchhiker taught me a lesson I'll never forget about the dangers of late-night kindness on empty roads. It happened on a Saturday night, somewhere around 1 in the morning, as I was driving down Highway 542 in New Jersey, a route I often took that wound through miles of dense forest with only occasional houses breaking up the darkness. My off-road lights cut through the blackness ahead, illuminating someone standing at the roadside, arm raised with thumb extended in that age-old request for help. My pulse quickened as I debated whether to stop, but something made me slow down to get a better look at this solitary figure in the middle of nowhere. He appeared to be a young man, maybe in his late 20s, wearing a light grey hooded sweatshirt with the hood pulled up despite the mild weather, and faded denim jeans that had seen better days. Against every instinct screaming at me to keep driving, I came to a stop and rolled down my window to ask where he was headed, trying to keep my voice steady and friendly. His response came in a deep, unnaturally quiet voice that seemed to absorb the surrounding silence rather than break it, saying only that he needed to go up the road a bit. When I told him to climb in, He moved with an unsettling slowness that made every movement seem calculated and deliberate. The door of my Jeep didn't close properly the first time due to the tight seals, and when I politely explained that he needed to slam it harder, his reaction sent chills down my spine. Instead of immediately complying, he turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't read in the dim interior light, then slowly, deliberately turned his head away and waited several long seconds before finally reopening the door and slamming it shut with unnecessary force. As we started moving down the dark highway, I pushed the speedometer well past the posted limit, desperate to get this increasingly uncomfortable encounter over with as quickly as possible. The silence in the cab grew thick and oppressive, and when I asked again how far he needed to go, another unnerving pause stretched between us before he repeated that it was just a few miles ahead. Through my peripheral vision, I could sense him turn his head to stare at me, and for what felt like an eternity, I could feel his gaze boring into the side of my face while I tried to focus on the road ahead. When he finally spoke again, his words made my hands grip the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. He said he'd been carrying something with him for weeks, wondering when the right moment would come to use it, and as he reached into his pocket, my worst fears materialized in the form of a large red-handled knife. The sight of it made my stomach drop, but what happened next was even more disturbing than any attack I had imagined. He told me to pull over next to an upcoming road sign, and when I complied, he began cutting into his own forearm, adding fresh wounds to old scars while making sounds that I still hear in nightmares. When he demanded that I get out of the car to see something behind the sign, raising the knife as an obvious threat, I knew my life hung in the balance of whatever decision I made next. Pretending to cooperate, I stepped out carefully, leaving my door open, and backed away with my hands visible and non-threatening. The moment he rounded the back of the vehicle to come to my side, I dove back into the driver's seat, threw the transmission into drive, and floored the accelerator, never once looking in the rearview mirror as I fled down that dark highway toward the safety of home. The party night mistake. The summer I got my driver's license should have been nothing but freedom and good times, but one night taught me how quickly celebration can turn to terror when you make the wrong choice on a dark road. I was 16, just 3 months into owning my first car, when my friend Alex invited me to one of those legendary countryside parties that everyone talks about for months afterward. Knowing I'd be in no condition to drive home, I left my Toyota at home and caught a ride with Alex and his girlfriend Brianna, who had volunteered to stay sober and get us home safely. The party was everything a teenage gathering in rural Virginia could be, held outside a small house where the nearest neighbors were too far away to complain about noise or music that thumped across the fields. Hours into the festivities, Brianna received an urgent call about a family emergency and had to leave immediately, assuring us she'd return or that we'd easily find another ride home among the dozens of people there. But as the night wore on and my judgment became increasingly impaired, I found myself searching through the crowd for Alex, only to discover that somehow, impossibly, he had left without me. By 2 in the morning, standing alone among strangers with no phone and no ride, I made the kind of decision that only seems reasonable when you're young, intoxicated, and desperate to get home. I stumbled out onto the dark highway and began walking, knowing the journey would take at least an hour in my current state, but seeing no other option. After what felt like miles, but was probably only 15 minutes, the distant glow of headlights appeared behind me, growing brighter as a vehicle approached. Relief flooded through me as I stuck out my thumb, and miracle of miracles, the car actually stopped, revealing a middle-aged man driving a beat-up Ford Explorer who asked where I was headed with what seemed like genuine concern. I mumbled something about my house being just down the road and around the bend, probably slurring badly enough that he could tell exactly what kind of night I'd had. He chuckled in what seemed like understanding and told me to hop in, and in my impaired state, I felt nothing but gratitude as I climbed into the passenger seat. Exhaustion and alcohol overwhelmed me almost immediately, and despite the stranger trying to make conversation, I felt myself sliding into unconsciousness, the last sensation being the rhythm of the road beneath the wheels. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was that nothing outside the windows looked familiar, and when I asked where we were going, his response to my direct question with an evasive one of his own sent sobering fear coursing through my system like ice water. When I told him he could let me out anywhere, and he responded with a firm refusal, my body reacted before my mind could fully process the danger, and I began to feel violently ill. As I started gagging, I saw his eyes leave the road to watch me with disgust, and in that moment of his distraction, survival instinct took over. I turned toward him and let nature take its course, making sure to empty the contents of my stomach all over his lap and the driver's seat, causing him to shout in rage and slam on the brakes. The moment the vehicle stopped, I burst out the door and ran blindly into the woods, crashing through underbrush until I found a cluster of bushes large enough to hide behind. I could hear him following with a flashlight, cursing and threatening as the beam swept back and forth across the forest floor, twice passing directly over my hiding spot without revealing me. When his footsteps finally moved deeper into the woods, I seized my chance and ran back to the road, only to find he'd been smart enough to lock his vehicle. By some divine intervention, another car appeared in the distance, and I ran into the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically and refusing to move aside until they stopped. When I explained that the man in the Explorer had taken me against my will, the shocked driver agreed to take me home, though I could see the questions in his eyes about why I hadn't gone to the police. The truth was, in my panic and impaired state, I had failed to note the license plate or any identifying details beyond the vehicle's make and color, a failure that haunts me still. These 3 stories serve as warnings that have shaped my life and my choices every time I see someone standing by the roadside with their thumb extended in hope or desperation. Whether it's the kind woman who discovered her compassion nearly cost her life, my own terrifying encounter on a dark New Jersey highway, or the teenage mistake that taught me how vulnerable we become when we trust the wrong stranger, the message remains constant and clear. No matter how sorry you feel for someone standing alone on an empty road, no matter how safe it might seem in the moment, the risk is simply too great because you never truly know who you're inviting into your car or what intentions hide behind a seemingly harmless request for help. The storm night passenger. The rain was coming down in sheets that night in Oregon, the kind of downpour that turns windshield wipers useless and makes every mile feel like 10. I was driving back from a business conference in Portland, taking the coastal route despite the weather because I needed time to think about the job offer I'd just received. Through the walls of water cascading down my windshield, I barely made out the figure hunched against the storm, one arm raised desperately toward the passing traffic that ignored their plight. Something about the sheer misery of standing in that torrential rain made me pump the brakes, my conscience overriding the voice in my head that reminded me of every horror movie that started exactly this way. As I pulled over, I could see it was a woman, maybe in her 40s, completely soaked through and shivering violently as she approached my car. Her story came out in chattering fragments between blue lips, something about her car breaking down miles back and her phone being dead, and before I knew it, I was unlocking the doors and cranking up the heat. She settled into the passenger seat with endless thank yous, wringing water from her long dark hair while apologizing for soaking my upholstery. We drove in comfortable conversation for about 20 minutes, discussing the unusual severity of the storm and how she'd been walking for over an hour before I stopped. But then she asked if we could make a quick detour to pick up her boyfriend who was waiting at a gas station just off the next exit. And something in the way she said it made every alarm bell in my head start ringing. When I politely explained that I was already running late and couldn't make any stops, her entire demeanor shifted like someone had flipped a switch. The grateful, shivering woman transformed into something else entirely as she began insisting, then demanding, that we pick up her boyfriend, her voice rising with each repetition. She started describing him in disturbing detail, mentioning his size, his strength, and how he didn't like to be kept waiting, especially by people who had promised to help. The threats became less subtle as she pulled out her phone, which miraculously seemed to be working now, and began texting rapidly while muttering about teaching me a lesson about real kindness. When I spotted a well-lit truck stop ahead, I made a split-second decision and pulled in, telling her this was as far as I could take her. She erupted in rage, screaming obscenities and promises that her boyfriend would find me, but I kept my doors locked and my hand on the horn until she finally got out, slamming the door hard enough to rock the entire vehicle. I waited until she stalked off toward the building before peeling out of that parking lot, checking my mirrors obsessively for the next 50 miles, half expecting to see headlights following me through the storm. Later, when I looked up news from that area, I found reports of couples working together to rob Good Samaritans who stopped to help supposedly stranded women, and I realized how close I'd come to becoming another victim of misplaced compassion on a stormy night. The Desert Highway Warning. Driving through the Arizona desert at night is an experience that makes you understand why people believe in alien abductions and supernatural encounters. It was 3 in the morning on Interstate 10, that long stretch between Phoenix and Tucson where cell phone signals go to die and the darkness seems to press against your windows like a living thing. I was making good time, pushing to reach my sister's house before dawn, when my headlights caught a figure that seemed to materialize out of the desert itself. He was young, maybe early 20s, wearing clothes that looked too clean and pressed for someone who'd been stranded on a desert highway. His thumb was out, but what struck me was his smile, bright and unwavering even as my high beams hit him full in the face. Against every rational thought, I found myself slowing down, maybe because he looked so harmless, maybe because the isolation of the desert made me crave human contact, even from a stranger. As he climbed into my car, bringing with him the scent of sage and something else I couldn't identify, he thanked me in a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in days. He said he was heading to Tucson for a fresh start, had been walking for hours after his ride abandoned him at a rest stop. His story seemed plausible enough, but there was something in the way he kept glancing at the desert outside, as if he was looking for something or someone in that endless darkness. We drove in relative quiet for about 15 minutes before he started talking about the desert, about how it was a perfect place to disappear, how bodies could go undiscovered for years in the right spots. He spoke with the kind of detail that made my skin crawl, describing how the heat and the creatures would take care of evidence, how the vastness swallowed secrets whole. When I tried to change the subject, he just smiled that unnerving smile and continued his morbid monologue. Things escalated when he reached into his backpack, and I tensed, ready to grab the pepper spray in my door pocket, but he only pulled out a worn notebook. He began reading from it, entries that sounded like confessions or fantasies. I couldn't tell which, about people he'd met on the road and what he'd wanted to do to them. His voice remained calm and conversational as he described violent scenarios that made my hands shake on the steering wheel, all while maintaining that horrible smile. When I saw the lights of a gas station in the distance, I told him my engine was overheating and I needed to stop immediately. He closed his notebook slowly, looked at me with those empty eyes, and said he understood perfectly that everyone had their breaking point. The moment he stepped out to use the restroom, I locked the doors and drove off, watching in my rearview mirror as he stood under the fluorescent lights, still smiling and waving as if we were old friends saying goodbye. The Mountain Pass Encounter. The mountain roads of Colorado in late autumn are treacherous enough without adding human danger to the mix, but that's exactly what I did one October evening when the aspens were turning gold. I was navigating the switchbacks near Loveland Pass, concentrating on the narrow road when my headlights swept across someone walking along the shoulder where there was barely room for a car, let alone a pedestrian. It was an older man, perhaps in his 60s, dressed in hiking gear that had seen better days and carrying himself with the exhausted gait of someone who'd been walking far too long. My first instinct was to keep driving because stopping on that narrow mountain road seemed dangerous enough without inviting a stranger into the equation. But when I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw him stumble, nearly falling into the guardrail that was the only thing between him and a 1,000-foot drop, I couldn't leave him there. I found a slightly wider spot to pull over and backed up carefully, rolling down my window to ask if he needed help while keeping my doors locked until I could assess the situation. His story was that he'd been hiking and gotten separated from his group. His phone had died, and he'd been trying to make it down to town for hours as the temperature dropped. He seemed coherent and genuinely distressed, showing me his dead phone as proof, so I made the decision to unlock the doors and let him warm up inside. He collapsed into the seat with obvious relief, thanking me repeatedly while rubbing his hands together and blowing on them to restore circulation. For the first few miles, everything seemed normal as he told me about his hiking group, how they'd started at dawn to summit one of the Fortinas, and how he'd taken a wrong turn on the descent. But gradually, inconsistencies began creeping into his story, details that didn't match up with someone who claimed to be an experienced hiker. He didn't know the name of the peak they'd supposedly climbed, couldn't name any of the trails in the area, and when I mentioned specific landmarks, he agreed with everything I said, even when I deliberately named places that didn't exist. The real fear began when he started asking increasingly personal questions about where I lived, whether anyone was expecting me, what my schedule was like for the next few days. He framed each question casually, but there was an intensity to his interest that made me regret every word I'd already shared. When he suggested we stop at a scenic overlook he knew about where we could see the lights of Denver, claiming it was just around the next bend, I knew with certainty that there was no overlook there and that his intentions were anything but scenic. I told him I'd actually just remembered I needed to pick up my husband from his job as a police officer, improvising wildly about how he'd be worried if I was late and would probably send units looking for me if I didn't show up soon. The change in the man's demeanor was instant, his friendly mask slipping just enough for me to see something calculating underneath. When we reached the next town, he suddenly remembered that this was actually where his friends were meeting him, thanking me hurriedly before disappearing into the darkness between streetlights, leaving me shaking with the realization of what might have happened on that isolated mountain road. The midnight train station. Working the late shift at a 24-hour diner means you see all kinds of characters, but nothing prepared me for what happened the night I gave a stranger a ride from the train station. It was past 2 in the morning when I finally clocked out, exhausted from dealing with the usual mix of drunks and insomniacs that frequent all-night establishments. The train station sat across from the diner, and as I walked to my car, I noticed a woman sitting on the bench outside, despite the fact that no trains ran at this hour. She looked to be in her 30s, well dressed in business attire that seemed out of place for the hour, clutching a small suitcase like it contained everything she owned. When she saw me approaching my car, she stood up quickly and called out, asking if I could possibly give her a ride to the nearest motel. She explained that she'd dozed off on the train, missed a stop, and ended up here with no way to get back until morning, her credit cards not working and her phone dead. Something about working in customer service makes you want to help people, and she seemed genuinely stranded, so I agreed to drop her at the motel that was only about 10 minutes away. She thanked me profusely as she got in, placing her suitcase carefully in the back seat and adjusting her coat with nervous movements. As we drove, she kept looking out the back window, and when I asked if everything was all right, she gave me a tight smile and said she just wanted to make sure no one from the train had followed her. The story that tumbled out over the next few minutes was bizarre and frightening in equal measure. She claimed she'd been riding the train to escape someone, that she'd been traveling for days, switching trains randomly to throw off pursuit. She insisted that certain passengers had been following her from car to car, that they communicated in codes she'd learned to recognize, that the conductor was in on it too. The more she talked, the more I realized I might have picked up someone having a serious mental health crisis. When we reached the motel, she suddenly grabbed my arm with surprising strength and begged me not to leave her there alone, insisting the people following her would find her within hours. She wanted me to drive her to the next town, then the next state, offering me crumpled bills from her coat pocket while describing elaborate conspiracy theories about who was after her and why. Her grip on my arm tightened painfully as her pleas became more desperate, and I had to physically pry her fingers off to maintain control of the situation. I managed to calm her down enough to get her out of the car, promising I'd wait while she checked in, though I had no intention of doing so. The moment she entered the motel office, I drove away, feeling guilty but also deeply unsettled by the encounter. I later learned from a co-worker that police had been called to that motel for a disturbance involving a woman who'd barricaded herself in a room, claiming assassins were coming for her. And I realized that sometimes the danger of picking up strangers isn't always what they might do to you, but what demons they're carrying with them. The festival aftermath. Music festivals in the middle of nowhere always end the same way. with thousands of exhausted people trying to leave at once, creating traffic jams that turn what should be a 2-hour drive into a 6-hour ordeal. I was inching along in the exodus from a 3-day festival in rural Tennessee, windows down to combat the heat, when I noticed 2 guys walking along the shoulder, thumbs out, looking like they'd had a rougher weekend than most. They were young, probably college age, carrying camping gear and looking sunburned and dehydrated. Maybe it was the festival atmosphere of peace and love still lingering, or maybe it was just sympathy for their obvious misery. But I pulled over and offered them a ride to the next town. They practically fell into my back seat with gratitude, introducing themselves as Kyle and Derek, explaining how their ride had left without them after an argument about something stupid. They seemed harmless enough, tired and dirty but friendly, sharing stories about bands they'd seen and comparing experiences from the weekend. For the first hour, everything was fine as we crawled through the traffic, windows down and music playing, just 3 festival goers decompressing from the weekend. But as traffic finally began to clear and we picked up speed, I noticed Kyle and Derek exchanging looks in the rearview mirror, conducting what seemed like an entire conversation without words. When Derek asked if I minded stopping somewhere so they could clean up, maybe at my place if it wasn't too much trouble, every instinct I had started screaming warnings. I politely declined, saying I lived too far out of the way, but they persisted, Kyle mentioning how they noticed I'd been camping alone all weekend, how they'd actually seen me around the festival several times. The implication that they'd been watching me sent chills down my spine, and when Derek casually mentioned that they knew which tent had been mine, I realized this meeting might not have been as random as I'd thought. When we reached a gas station at the next exit, I pulled in and told them I needed to fill up, suggesting they could find another ride from there since I was turning off soon anyway. They protested at first, Kyle's friendly demeanor dropping as he insisted I'd promised to take them further, while Derek moved to block my door when I tried to get out. I had to threaten to lean on the horn and scream for help before they finally grabbed their gear and got out. But not before Derek leaned in close and whispered that they'd see me at next year's festival. I drove home taking random turns and doubling back multiple times, paranoid that somehow they were following me despite having no vehicle. I skipped the next 2 years of that festival, and even now, whenever I consider stopping for hitchhikers who look harmless enough, I remember those 2 seemingly friendly faces and how quickly the mask can slip when strangers think they have you vulnerable and alone. The night visitor. This experience from 5 years ago still makes my hands shake whenever I think about it, especially on quiet nights when I'm alone in my apartment. I was 24 and had just moved into my first place by myself, a small house on the outskirts of Portland where the rent was affordable because the neighborhood was still what they called transitioning. The first few weeks were uneventful as I settled into living independently, learning the quirks of the old heating system and getting used to every creak and groan the house made at night. Everything changed on a Thursday evening when I was working late from home, trying to finish a project deadline that had been moved up without warning. Around 11:30, I heard what sounded like footsteps on my front porch, slow and deliberate, as if someone was trying not to make noise. Living alone had made me paranoid about every sound, so I peered through the peephole but saw nothing in the dim porch light, telling myself it was probably just a raccoon or the wind knocking something around. The footsteps returned an hour later, this time accompanied by a soft scratching at the door, like fingernails dragging across wood. My blood turned cold as I watched the doorknob slowly turn, testing whether it was locked, and I thanked every instinct that had made me install a deadbolt the day I moved in. Through the peephole, I finally saw him. A man in his 30s wearing ordinary clothes, but with eyes that reflected the porch light like an animal's, standing perfectly still and staring directly at the peephole as if he knew I was watching. We stayed frozen like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds before he smiled, a slow spreading grin that made my stomach drop, and he mouthed words I couldn't hear through the door. He stepped back into the shadows beyond the porch light's reach, but I knew he hadn't left because I could still sense his presence, that feeling of being watched that makes every hair on your body stand up. I called the police with shaking hands, whispering to the dispatcher while keeping my eye pressed to the peephole, terrified that if I looked away he would somehow get inside. The truly disturbing part came when the police arrived 15 minutes later and found no one outside, but they discovered something that still haunts me to this day. On my back door, the one I hadn't even thought to check, they found deep scratches in the wood spelling out a message that simply said, "Next time." I moved out the following week, breaking my lease and losing my deposit, but no amount of money was worth staying in that house another night. The Mountain Road. The summer after graduation, my best friend Marcus and I decided to take a road trip through the Colorado mountains before starting our corporate jobs in the fall. We had mapped out a route through some of the less touristy areas, wanting to see the real wilderness away from the crowded tourist traps, which in retrospect was our first mistake. The second mistake was deciding to drive through the night to reach our next campsite, thinking we could handle the winding mountain roads in the darkness with just our headlights and youthful confidence to guide us. It was around 2 in the morning when we saw her, a woman standing in the middle of the narrow road wearing what looked like a hospital gown, her feet bare despite the cold mountain air. Marcus slammed on the brakes, barely stopping in time, and we sat there staring as she slowly turned to face us, her movements jerky and unnatural like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. Her face was pale in our headlights, with dark circles under her eyes and hair that hung in matted strands, but it was her smile that made us both stop breathing, too wide and showing too many teeth. She started walking toward the car with that same puppet-like movement, and every instinct screamed at us to drive around her and flee. But the road was too narrow with a cliff wall on one side and a steep drop on the other. Marcus put the car in reverse, but she moved faster than seemed possible, suddenly right at his window, pressing her face against the glass and leaving smears of something dark that wasn't quite blood. She spoke in a voice that sounded like it was coming from far away, asking us to take her home, repeating it over and over while her fingers tapped against the window in a rhythm that made my teeth hurt. That's when we noticed the others emerging from the trees, more figures in hospital gowns moving with that same unnatural gait, surrounding the car from all sides. Marcus made a decision that probably saved our lives, spinning the wheel hard and scraping the passenger side against the cliff wall as he forced the car past them, metal screaming against rock as we fled down the mountain road. We didn't stop driving until we reached a gas station at dawn, where the attendant took one look at our faces and the scratches covering the car and told us we were lucky to be alive. He explained that there used to be a psychiatric facility up in those mountains that had burned down 20 years ago with patients still inside, and that locals avoided that stretch of road after dark. Whether what we saw was real or some kind of shared hallucination brought on by exhaustion and altitude, I can't say for certain, but Marcus and I never spoke about that night again, and we definitely never took another road trip together. The basement discovery. My husband and I had been house hunting for months when we finally found what seemed like the perfect place, a Victorian-era home that was inexplicably underpriced in a neighborhood we could never normally afford. The real estate agent seemed nervous showing it to us, constantly checking her watch and insisting we needed to make a quick decision because there was so much interest, which should have been our first warning sign. But we were blinded by the beautiful original hardwood floors, the ornate fireplaces, and the fantasy of fixing up a historical home together. The problem started almost immediately after we moved in, beginning with sounds from the basement that the previous owners had painted over and sealed shut, claiming it was just used for storage and had some flooding issues. Late at night, we would hear what sounded like footsteps pacing back and forth, sometimes accompanied by a rhythmic tapping that would go on for hours. My husband insisted it was just the old pipes or the house settling, but I noticed he started finding excuses to work late at the office, leaving me alone with those sounds more and more often. After 3 weeks of sleepless nights, I couldn't take it anymore and decided to investigate the basement while my husband was at work, using a crowbar to pry open the painted shut door. The smell that rushed out made me gag, a combination of mildew and something sweet and rotten that coated the back of my throat. The wooden stairs creaked ominously under my weight as I descended with just my phone's flashlight, revealing a space that was wrong in every possible way. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, all showing the same young woman in various poses and locations around what was clearly our house, but decorated in styles from different decades. In some photos she looked happy, in others terrified, but in all of them she appeared to be the same age, never growing older despite the changing fashions and furnishings around her. The center of the room held an old brass bed with restraints still attached to the frame, and beside it sat a journal filled with entries dating back over a century, all written in different hands but describing the same woman. The final entry, dated just a month before we bought the house, simply read, "She's getting stronger. We can't contain her anymore. Forgive us." That's when I heard the breathing behind me, slow and deliberate, and felt cold fingers brush against my neck. I ran up those stairs faster than I've ever moved in my life, slamming the door behind me and calling my husband to tell him we were leaving immediately. We stayed in a hotel that night and hired movers to get our things, never setting foot in that house again. The camping trip. Every summer since we were kids, my cousin Derek and I would go camping in the same spot near Lake Superior where our fathers had taken us for years. It was our tradition, just the two of us for a week of fishing, hiking, and escaping from our increasingly complicated adult lives. This particular year, we decided to try a new area deeper in the woods that Derek had heard about from a coworker, promising better fishing and complete isolation from other campers. The hike to the spot took longer than expected, and by the time we set up camp, the sun was already setting through the dense canopy of trees. As we built our fire and cooked dinner, we both noticed how quiet the forest was, none of the usual bird calls or insect sounds that typically provided a constant background noise. Derek joked that maybe we'd finally found a spot so remote that even the animals avoided it, but neither of us laughed, both feeling the weight of that unnatural silence. That first night, we were awakened by the sound of something large moving through our campsite, knocking over our cooler and scattering our supplies. We lay frozen in our tent, listening to heavy breathing and footsteps that sounded almost human but not quite right, as if whatever was out there was walking on all fours. Through the thin tent walls, we could see a massive shadow circling us, occasionally stopping to sniff at the tent fabric, and I had to bite my hand to keep from screaming when I saw the outline of fingers pressing against the material. The thing spoke, if you could call it speaking, in a voice that sounded like multiple people talking at once, some young, some old, all slightly out of sync. It knew our names, mentioning details about our lives that no stranger could know, trying to coax us out of the tent with promises and threats that became increasingly frantic as the night wore on. We huddled together until dawn, when the thing finally retreated with a sound that was part scream and part laugh, leaving us to pack up our destroyed campsite with shaking hands. On the hike back to our car, we found evidence that we weren't the first campers to have this experience, discovering abandoned tents deeper in the woods, some looking decades old, all with long tears in the fabric as if something had forced its way inside. We never reported what happened, knowing how insane it would sound, but we also never went camping again, our decades-long tradition ending with that single night of terror in the deep woods. The hotel room. Business travel had become such a routine part of my life that I could check into a hotel, attend meetings, and fly home without really registering any of it. That changed during a trip to Detroit when the conference hotel was overbooked, and they had to put me in a smaller place a few blocks away, an old building that had clearly seen better days, but was clean enough and close to where I needed to be. The desk clerk seemed surprised when I checked in, mentioning they didn't get many business travelers, mostly just people passing through who needed a cheap room for the night. My room was on the third floor at the end of a long hallway that flickered with dying fluorescent lights, and the moment I entered, I felt something was off about the space. The air felt heavy and stale despite the window being cracked open, and there was an odd smell like copper pennies mixed with cleaning chemicals that seemed to get stronger near the bathroom. I convinced myself I was just tired from the flight and tried to settle in for the night, ordering room service and reviewing my presentation for the next morning. Around midnight, I was awakened by the sound of running water and realized the bathroom faucet had turned on by itself, not a drip but a full stream. As I got up to turn it off, I noticed the mirror was fogged despite the water being cold, and written in the condensation were the words, "Room for one more." I backed out of the bathroom, grabbing my phone to call the front desk, but the line was dead, and my cell phone showed no signal despite having full bars just hours earlier. That's when the knocking started, not at my door but from inside the walls, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to move around the room following me as I frantically gathered my things. The closet door slowly swung open on its own, revealing clothes that weren't mine, vintage dresses and suits from different eras, all neatly hung as if waiting for their owners to return. The knocking grew louder and more insistent, joined by voices whispering in languages I didn't recognize, until the walls themselves seemed to be breathing. I ran from that room without looking back, not stopping until I reached the lobby, where I found the desk clerk slumped over and unresponsive. I fled into the street and didn't stop running until I found an all-night diner where I called a cab to take me to the airport. When I tried to find the hotel online later to leave a warning review, I discovered it had been demolished in the 1960s. The lot where I'd spent that terrifying night now occupied by an office building that had been there for decades. The man in my backyard. My name is Marcus, and I'm 24 years old now. But this story happened when I was just 16. I need to tell someone about this because it still haunts me every single night. Back then, I lived with my parents in a small house in Ohio. It was a quiet neighborhood where nothing bad ever happened. Everyone knew each other and we all felt safe. My parents worked night shifts at the hospital. They were both nurses and usually came home around 7 in the morning. This meant I was alone most nights, but I never minded it. I was a teenager who enjoyed having the house to myself. I could play video games as loud as I wanted. I could eat whatever I wanted from the fridge. I could stay up as late as I wanted without anyone telling me to go to bed. It was perfect, or at least I thought it was. One Tuesday night in October, something changed everything. It was around 11 p.m. and I was in my room playing games online with friends. My headset was on and we were all laughing and having a good time. Then my dog Max started barking like crazy downstairs. Max never barked at night unless something was really wrong. I took off my headset and listened carefully. The barking got louder and more aggressive. I could hear him scratching at the back door. "Guys, I'll be right back," I told my friends. I went downstairs to see what was bothering Max. He was at the glass sliding door that led to our backyard. His fur was standing up and he was growling low in his throat. I flipped on the backyard light and looked outside. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just our lawn chairs, the old swing set, and Mom's garden. Then I saw him. There was a man standing perfectly still next to our shed. He was wearing all black clothes and just staring at our house, not moving at all, just standing there like a statue. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I quickly turned off the light, hoping he didn't see me. But when I peeked through the curtain again, he had moved. Now he was standing in the middle of our yard, still not moving, still just staring at the house. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but my hands were shaking so badly. Before I could dial, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of our shed door slowly creaking open. But the man was still standing in the yard. That meant there was someone else out there. Max was going absolutely crazy now, barking and jumping at the door. I ran to make sure all the doors were locked. The front door was locked, the side door was locked. But when I got to the basement door, my heart sank. It was slightly open. I know I had locked it earlier because I always check it. Someone had gotten inside. I could hear footsteps on the basement stairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming up. I grabbed Max and ran upstairs to my parents' room. I locked the door and pushed their heavy dresser in front of it. Then I called 911 and whispered what was happening. "Someone's in my house. Please send help," I begged. The operator told me to stay quiet and hide. She said police were on their way. I could hear the footsteps in the hallway now. They stopped right outside the bedroom door. The doorknob slowly turned, but the lock held. Then I heard a voice that I'll never forget. "I know you're in there," the man said calmly. "I've been watching you for weeks. I know when your parents leave for work. I know you're all alone in there." The doorknob rattled again, harder this time. Max was growling, but I held his mouth shut. I was crying and trying not to make any sound. "Open the door, and I promise I won't hurt you," he lied. I could hear the smile in his voice. Then he started kicking the door. Hard kicks that made the whole frame shake. The dresser was sliding with each kick. I thought I was going to die that night. But then I heard the beautiful sound of sirens. The kicking stopped immediately. I heard running footsteps going back down the stairs. I stayed hidden until the police knocked and identified themselves. When I finally came out, I was shaking uncontrollably. The police searched the whole house and yard. They found the basement window had been pried open. They also found something that still gives me nightmares. In our shed, they found pictures. Dozens of pictures of me taken from outside our windows. Pictures of me sleeping, eating, watching TV. Some were dated from months ago. There was also a notebook with our family's schedule written down. He knew exactly when I would be alone. They never caught him. The man in black vanished that night and was never seen again. We moved to a different state the very next month. I'm 24 now, and I still check every lock 3 times before bed. I still jump when I hear footsteps at night, and I never, ever stay home alone anymore. The man in my backyard. My name is Marcus, and I'm 24 years old now. But this story happened when I was just 16. I need to tell someone about this because it still haunts me every single night. Back then, I lived with my parents in a small house in Ohio. It was a quiet neighborhood where nothing bad ever happened. Everyone knew each other and we all felt safe. My parents worked night shifts at the hospital. They were both nurses and usually came home around 7 in the morning. This meant I was alone most nights, but I never minded it. I was a teenager who enjoyed having the house to myself. I could play video games as loud as I wanted. I could eat whatever I wanted from the fridge. I could stay up as late as I wanted without anyone telling me to go to bed. It was perfect, or at least I thought it was. One Tuesday night in October, something changed everything. It was around 11 p.m. and I was in my room playing games online with friends. My headset was on and we were all laughing and having a good time. Then my dog Max started barking like crazy downstairs. Max never barked at night unless something was really wrong. I took off my headset and listened carefully. The barking got louder and more aggressive. I could hear him scratching at the back door. "Guys, I'll be right back," I told my friends. I went downstairs to see what was bothering Max. He was at the glass sliding door that led to our backyard. His fur was standing up and he was growling low in his throat. I flipped on the backyard light and looked outside. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Just our lawn chairs, the old swing set, and Mom's garden. Then I saw him. There was a man standing perfectly still next to our shed. He was wearing all black clothes and just staring at our house. Not moving at all, just standing there like a statue. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I quickly turned off the light, hoping he didn't see me. But when I peeked through the curtain again, he had moved. Now he was standing in the middle of our yard. Still not moving, still just staring at the house. I grabbed my phone to call 911, but my hands were shaking so badly. Before I could dial, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of our shed door slowly creaking open. But the man was still standing in the yard. That meant there was someone else out there. Max was going absolutely crazy now, barking and jumping at the door. I ran to make sure all the doors were locked. The front door was locked, the side door was locked. But when I got to the basement door, my heart sank. It was slightly open. I know I had locked it earlier because I always check it. Someone had gotten inside. I could hear footsteps on the basement stairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming up. I grabbed Max and ran upstairs to my parents' room. I locked the door and pushed their heavy dresser in front of it. Then I called 911 and whispered what was happening. "Someone's in my house. Please send help," I begged. The operator told me to stay quiet and hide. She said police were on their way. I could hear the footsteps in the hallway now. They stopped right outside the bedroom door. The doorknob slowly turned, but the lock held. Then I heard a voice that I'll never forget. "I know you're in there," the man said calmly. "I've been watching you for weeks. I know when your parents leave for work. I know you're all alone in there." The doorknob rattled again, harder this time. Max was growling, but I held his mouth shut. I was crying and trying not to make any sound. "Open the door, and I promise I won't hurt you," he lied. I could hear the smile in his voice. Then he started kicking the door. Hard kicks that made the whole frame shake. The dresser was sliding with each kick. I thought I was going to die that night. But then I heard the beautiful sound of sirens. The kicking stopped immediately. I heard running footsteps going back down the stairs. I stayed hidden until the police knocked and identified themselves. When I finally came out, I was shaking uncontrollably. The police searched the whole house and yard. They found the basement window had been pried open. They also found something that still gives me nightmares. In our shed, they found pictures. Dozens of pictures of me taken from outside our windows. Pictures of me sleeping, eating, watching TV. Some were dated from months ago. There was also a notebook with our family's schedule written down. He knew exactly when I would be alone. They never caught him. The man in black vanished that night and was never seen again. We moved to a different state the very next month. I'm 24 now, and I still check every lock 3 times before bed. I still jump when I hear footsteps at night. And I never, ever stay home alone anymore. The basement room. My name is Jennifer, and I'm 19 years old. This happened last year when I was still in high school. I'm sharing this because I need people to know the truth. My family had just moved into an old house in Pennsylvania. It was a big Victorian house that had been empty for years. My parents got it for really cheap, which should have been a warning sign. The realtor mentioned that the previous owners left suddenly. She didn't say why, and my parents didn't ask. They were just happy to finally own such a beautiful home. I got the biggest bedroom on the 2nd floor. It had these huge windows and vintage wallpaper. Everything seemed perfect for the first week. Then I started noticing strange things. It began with sounds coming from below my room. Not from the 1st floor, but from somewhere deeper. Like there was another room under the basement. I mentioned it to my parents, but they said it was just the old pipes. Old houses make weird noises, they said. But I knew this wasn't normal house sounds. These were footsteps, slow and heavy. Sometimes I heard what sounded like furniture being moved. Other times it was a low humming, like someone singing. After 2 weeks, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to investigate the basement myself. I waited until my parents went grocery shopping one Saturday. Armed with a flashlight, I went down to explore. Our basement was mostly unfinished with concrete walls. There were boxes from our move scattered everywhere. I walked around looking for any sign of another room. Then I found it behind the furnace. There was a small door, maybe 4 feet tall. It was painted the same color as the wall to blend in. If you weren't looking for it, you'd never notice it. My hands were trembling as I reached for the handle. The door was locked with an old padlock, but the wood around it was rotting and weak. I found a hammer and carefully pried the lock off. The door swung open, revealing complete darkness. A smell hit me immediately, musty and sweet and wrong. I shined my flashlight inside and gasped. It was a small room, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet. The walls were covered in children's drawings, hundreds of them, layered on top of each other. But these weren't happy drawings. They showed scary things, monsters, people crying, darkness. In the corner was a small mattress with old blankets. There were empty food cans and water bottles scattered around. Someone had been living down here. On the mattress was a teddy bear, old and moldy. Next to it was a notebook. I picked it up with shaking hands and opened it. The first page had a child's writing. My name is Lucy. I am 8 years old. They put me down here when I'm bad. I've been bad for 47 days now. I can hear them walking above me. Sometimes they forget to bring food. Mr. Bear keeps me company. I promise I'll be good if they let me out. I dropped the notebook and ran. I ran up both sets of stairs and out of the house. I called my parents, crying hysterically. When they got home, I showed them everything. Their faces went white when they saw that room. We called the police immediately. They investigated and found out the horrible truth. The previous owners had a daughter named Lucy. She had supposedly died from an illness 10 years ago. But there was never a funeral, never a body. The police suspected she had been kept in that room. They think she died down there, alone and afraid. The parents had fled when neighbors started asking questions. We moved out that same week. I couldn't sleep in that house another night. Sometimes I still think about Lucy. I think about how scared she must have been, how she died hoping someone would save her. I kept her teddy bear. I know it's weird, but I felt like someone should remember her. Someone should know that she existed, that she was more than just a sad story in a hidden room. If you ever move into an old house, check everywhere. Check behind walls, under floors, in places that don't make sense. Because sometimes houses hide terrible secrets, and sometimes those secrets have names. The Midnight Train. My name is David, and I'm 27 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened 5 years ago. I've never told anyone the complete truth until now. I was working late nights at a warehouse back then. I usually got off work around 2 a.m. and took the train home. The station was always empty at that hour. Just me, the fluorescent lights, and the occasional rat. I actually liked the quiet ride home. It gave me time to decompress after a hard shift. This particular night in November was colder than usual. I remember my breath making clouds in the air. I was sitting on the bench waiting for the 2:15 train. That's when I noticed I wasn't alone on the platform. There was a woman standing at the far end. She was wearing a white dress which seemed odd for the weather. She wasn't moving, just standing there facing the tracks. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was drunk or just weird. The city was full of strange people, especially at night. But then I noticed something that made me uneasy. She was barefoot on the freezing concrete, and her dress was moving like there was wind. But there was no wind that night. The air was completely still. I looked away, not wanting to stare. When I looked back, she was closer. Not walking closer, just suddenly there. Now she was maybe 20 feet away, still facing the tracks, still not moving. Her dress kept flowing in that non-existent wind. I could see her hair now, long and black and wet-looking. I stood up, ready to move to another bench. That's when she turned her head toward me. Just her head. Her body stayed facing forward. Her face was wrong. Her skin was too pale, almost blue. Her eyes were solid black, no whites at all. And she was smiling this horrible wide smile. "The train is coming," she said. Her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. I looked down the tracks, but saw no lights. When I looked back, she was even closer, now only 10 feet away. "You should stand back," she said, still smiling. "Accidents happen when you stand too close." I backed away from the platform edge. My heart was racing and my hands were sweating. Every instinct told me to run, but I didn't want to turn my back on her. She tilted her head at an unnatural angle. "I stood too close once," she whispered. "The train didn't stop in time. Now I wait here every night, waiting for someone to stand too close." She moved again without walking. Now she was right in front of me. I could smell her, like pond water and rust. Her black eyes reflected nothing, just empty darkness. "Stand closer," she said, reaching out a pale hand. Her fingers were too long, with too many joints. I stumbled backward and almost fell. That's when I heard the train horn in the distance. The woman's smile got impossibly wider. "It's coming," she sang in that watery voice. "Time to stand close to the edge. Come stand with me." She grabbed my wrist with those horrible fingers. Her touch was ice cold and wet. I tried to pull away, but her grip was impossibly strong. She started pulling me toward the platform edge. I could see the train lights now, getting closer. I did the only thing I could think of. I closed my eyes and screamed as loud as I could. When I opened them, she was gone. My wrist was red where she had grabbed me. The train pulled up normally and I got on. The conductor looked at me strangely, but said nothing. I took a different way home after that night. I never took the late train again, but sometimes I check the news for that station. Every few months, there's another accident. Someone falls onto the tracks late at night. They always find them standing too close to the edge, and witnesses say they saw them talking to someone. Someone in a white dress who vanished when the train came. I still have marks on my wrist where she grabbed me. 5 years later, and they never faded. Sometimes they hurt when it's cold, and sometimes I dream about that smile, that impossible wide smile and those black eyes. If you ever wait for a late night train, be careful. Don't stand too close to the edge. And if you see a woman in white, run. Don't look back, just run. My roommate's secret. My name is Sarah, and I'm 22 years old. This happened during my sophomore year of college. I still have nightmares about what I discovered. I was sharing a dorm room with a girl named Emma. She seemed perfect when we first met. Friendly, clean, respectful of my space. We became good friends pretty quickly. She was a nursing student like me. We studied together and went to parties together. Everything was great for the first semester. But after winter break, Emma changed. She became quiet and withdrawn. She started sleeping during the day and staying up all night. I would wake up at 3 a.m. and see her sitting at her desk, just sitting there in the dark, not moving. When I asked if she was okay, she would just smile. "I'm fine," she would say. just studying. But her textbooks were always closed. Then I started noticing other strange things. She stopped eating in front of me. I never saw her go to the bathroom. And she had this new smell, sweet but rotten, like flowers that had been left in water too long. I tried talking to her, but she always changed the subject. She said she was just stressed about exams. But I knew something was seriously wrong. One night I pretended to fall asleep early. I kept my eyes barely open and watched her. Around midnight, she got up from her bed. She moved to her closet and opened it quietly. Then she did something that made no sense. She climbed inside and closed the door. I waited for her to come back out. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 30. She never came out. I got up and slowly approached the closet. I put my ear against the door and listened. I could hear something, but it wasn't normal. It sounded like chewing, wet, grinding sounds like an animal eating. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. I yanked the door open and screamed. Emma was crouched in the corner. Her mouth was covered in something dark. In her hands was a rat, half eaten. She looked up at me with eyes that glowed in the dark. "I was so hungry," she whispered. Her voice didn't sound human anymore. I backed away and hit the light switch. In the bright light, I could see the truth. Her skin was grey and peeling. Her teeth were sharp, like filed points, and her fingers ended in black claws. "What are you?" I managed to ask. She stood up slowly, bones cracking. "I don't know," she said, starting to cry. "It started over break. My family. They did something to me. They said it would make me special. But now I'm always hungry, and normal food makes me sick." She stepped toward me, and I ran. I ran out of the room and down the hall. I could hear her behind me, crying and calling my name. I spent the night in the lobby, too scared to go back. The next morning, campus security went to check. The room was empty. All of Emma's things were gone. It was like she had never existed. The closet was clean, no sign of what I had seen. The school said she had withdrawn for family reasons. They acted like I was crazy when I told them what happened. No one believed me. I had to finish the year with no roommate. Everyone whispered that I had made it up, that I had driven Emma away with false stories. But I know what I saw that night. Sometimes I Google her name, trying to find answers. But there's nothing, like she disappeared completely. I graduated and moved on with my life. But I still check my closets before I go to sleep. And I never eat meat anymore. The sound of chewing makes me remember. It makes me remember those wet sounds in the dark, and Emma's glowing eyes looking up at me. If your roommate starts acting strange, pay attention. Don't ignore the warning signs like I did, because sometimes people aren't what they seem, and sometimes they're not people at all. The church at night. My name is Michael, and I'm 30 years old now. This story happened when I was 17. I grew up in a small town in Georgia, the kind where everyone knows everyone, where nothing bad ever happens, or so we all thought. I worked part-time as a janitor at our local church. It was easy money for a teenager. I would go in after evening service and clean up. Usually took about 2 hours to finish everything. The pastor gave me a key and trusted me completely. I had been doing this job for 6 months without any problems. But one Wednesday night in December changed everything. I arrived at the church around 9 p.m. as usual. The parking lot was empty, which was normal. I unlocked the front door and went inside. The sanctuary was dark except for the exit signs. I flipped on the lights and started my routine. First, I collected all the hymn books and put them back. Then I vacuumed between the pews. Everything was going normally until I reached the altar. There was something on the floor I hadn't seen before. It looked like dark red paint spilled in a pattern. But when I got closer, I realized it wasn't paint. It was blood, arranged in a perfect circle. In the center were burned candles I didn't recognize. Black candles with symbols carved into them. My first thought was to call the pastor. But then I heard something that made me freeze. Footsteps coming from the basement. The basement door was supposed to be locked. Only the pastor and I had keys. The footsteps were getting closer, coming up the stairs. I quickly turned off my vacuum and hid behind the organ. The basement door opened slowly. A figure in a black robe stepped out. Their face was hidden under a hood. They walked to the blood circle and knelt down. Then they started speaking in a language I didn't understand. Their voice was deep and seemed to echo unnaturally. More figures emerged from the basement. 5, 10, 15 people in black robes. They formed a circle around the blood pattern. All of them started chanting together. The air in the church became thick and hard to breathe. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. The cross on the wall started shaking. Then I recognized one of the voices. My blood turned to ice in my veins. It was Mr. Henderson, my history teacher. I peeked out and saw other familiar faces under the hoods. The bank manager, the sheriff's deputy, the librarian, people I had known my whole life, respected members of our community. They were all here doing something evil. The chanting got louder and faster. The blood circle started glowing with a dim red light. Something was happening in the center of it. The air was shimmering like heat waves. A shape was forming out of nothing. I couldn't look away even though every instinct screamed to run. The shape became clearer, tall and wrong. It had too many arms and its head was wrong, like an animal skull but bigger. When it spoke, the windows rattled. "Who has summoned me?" it asked. Its voice was like grinding metal. Mr. Henderson stepped forward and bowed. "We offer you this sacred place," he said, "in exchange for your gifts." The thing laughed and the sound hurt my ears. That's when my phone rang. The loud ringtone echoed through the sanctuary. Every hooded head turned toward my hiding spot. The creature's many eyes focused on me. "We have a witness," it growled. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Behind me, I could hear them following. Their footsteps thundered on the church floor. I burst through the front door and kept running. I ran all the way home without stopping. I locked every door and window. Then I called my parents and told them everything. They didn't believe me at first. But then we heard the news the next morning. The church had burned down during the night. The official cause was an electrical fire. But I knew the truth. We moved away within a month. My parents said it was for Dad's new job. But I saw how they looked at our neighbors differently. How they jumped at every knock on the door. I'm 30 now and live in a different state. But sometimes I Google my old town. The church was never rebuilt. And people keep disappearing there. 1 or 2 every year. Without explanation. I know why they disappear. I know what's hungry in that town. And I know who's feeding it. If you ever work alone at night, be careful. Pay attention to who has keys. Because sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones you trust. And sometimes they worship things that shouldn't exist. The hiking trail. My name is Ashley, and I'm 25 years old. This happened 3 years ago during spring break. I still can't hike alone anymore. My boyfriend Jake and I decided to go camping. We picked a trail in the mountains of Colorado. It was supposed to be a moderate difficulty hike. Just challenging enough to be fun, but not dangerous. We had all the right gear and plenty of experience. What could go wrong, right? We started the trail early Saturday morning. The weather was perfect. Sunny but cool. The first few hours were amazing. Beautiful views, fresh air, just us and nature. We were making good time toward the camping area. Around noon, we stopped for lunch by a stream. That's when we noticed we weren't alone. There was another hiker about 50 yards behind us, an older man with a large backpack. He waved when he saw us looking. We waved back, being polite. After lunch, we continued up the trail. The man stayed behind us, keeping the same distance. At first, we didn't think anything of it. Lots of people hike these trails. But after 2 hours, he was still there. Always the same 50 yards behind. Never getting closer, never falling back. Maybe he's just going to the same campsite, Jake said. But something felt wrong to me. When we sped up, he sped up. When we slowed down, he slowed down, like he was matching our pace exactly. I started glancing back more often. The man never seemed tired, never stopped for water or rest, just kept walking with that same steady pace. As afternoon turned to evening, my unease grew. We were getting close to the camping area, but it would be dark soon. Let's go off trail, I suggested to Jake. See if he follows us. Jake thought I was being paranoid, but agreed. We took a small side path into the trees. After a few minutes, we stopped and listened. Footsteps on the main trail, coming closer. Then they stopped right where we had turned off. Silence for a long moment. Then the footsteps started again, coming down our side path. Now Jake looked worried too. We moved faster through the trees. The footsteps behind us sped up to match. No more pretending this was coincidence. This man was definitely following us. The sun was setting and shadows filled the forest. We couldn't see him anymore, but could hear him. Branches breaking, leaves rustling. Getting closer. Run, Jake whispered. We took off through the trees. Our heavy packs slowed us down. Behind us, the footsteps turned into running too, but his sounded different. Too fast, too light, like he wasn't carrying a pack anymore. We burst into a small clearing and stopped. There was an old ranger station there, abandoned but still standing. The door was broken, but we pushed inside. We barricaded the door with old furniture. Then we huddled in the corner, trying to catch our breath. The footsteps circled the building slowly. We could hear him testing the walls, looking for another way in. Then his face appeared at the broken window. But it wasn't the same man from the trail. This face was younger, cleaner, like he had removed a disguise. His eyes were bright with excitement. "Found you," he said with a smile. "This is my favorite part." He pulled something from his jacket. In the dim light, I saw it was a hunting knife. "I've been tracking you all day," he said. "You gave me a good chase. Better than the last couple." Jake grabbed a broken chair leg as a weapon. I found a rusty metal bar. We stood together, ready to fight. The man laughed at our makeshift weapons. "This is going to be fun," he said. He started climbing through the window. That's when we heard the helicopter, search and rescue, flying low over the forest. Jake had triggered his emergency beacon earlier. I had forgotten all about it in our panic. The man heard it too and cursed. He dropped back outside and looked up. "Next time," he said to us. Then he vanished into the dark forest. The helicopter spotted our flashlights. They guided rescue teams to us within an hour. We told them everything about the man. They searched but found no trace of him. Just an abandoned backpack on the main trail. Inside they found rope, duct tape, and knives, and a journal with details about other hikers, some of whom had gone missing in these mountains. We gave detailed descriptions to the police, but they never caught him. More hikers have vanished since then, always on remote trails, always in spring. I don't hike anymore. Jake and I broke up. Too many bad memories. Sometimes I have nightmares about that face in the window, those excited eyes and that terrible smile. "This is my favorite part," he said. I wonder how many times he said that. How many people heard those words as their last? If you go hiking, never go alone. Watch for people who match your pace too perfectly. And always bring an emergency beacon, because sometimes the scariest predators walk on two legs, and they're very good at hunting. The motel room. My name is Carlos, and I'm 28 years old. This happened last year during a business trip. I still can't stay in motels anymore. I was driving from Texas to California for a conference. It's a long drive, but I wanted to save money. Flying was too expensive for my small company. I had planned to drive straight through, but after 14 hours, I was exhausted. My eyes kept closing at the wheel, so I decided to stop for the night. I found a cheap motel just off the highway, the kind with flickering neon signs, where you pay cash and don't ask questions. It was past midnight and I just needed sleep. The desk clerk was an old woman watching TV. She barely looked at me as I paid, just slid a key across the counter. "Room 13, she said. "End of the row." I should have known that was a bad sign, but I was too tired to care. The room was exactly what you'd expect. Stained carpet, ancient TV, suspicious bedspread. But it had a bed, and that's all I needed. I threw my bag in the corner and collapsed. I was asleep within minutes. I woke up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom. As I walked past the window, I stopped. The curtain was open slightly. I was sure I had closed it completely. I looked outside and my blood ran cold. There was a man standing in the parking lot. He was facing my room, perfectly still, just standing there in the dark. I quickly closed the curtain fully, told myself it was just another guest. Maybe he was drunk or lost. I went to the bathroom and back to bed, but I couldn't fall back asleep. Something felt wrong about that man, about how still he was standing. After 30 minutes, I had to look again. I carefully peeked through the curtain. He was still there, same spot, same position, still facing my room. But now there were two more people with him, all three standing perfectly still, all three facing my window. My hands started shaking. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. I grabbed my phone to call 911. No signal, which was strange. I had full bars when I checked in. I tried the room phone, but it was dead. That's when I heard the doorknob rattle. Someone was trying to open my door. The deadbolt held, but they kept trying. Slowly, patiently, like they had all night. I looked through the peephole. The hallway was dark, but I could see shapes. More people standing outside my door. Not moving, not talking, just standing. The doorknob stopped rattling. Everything went quiet. Too quiet. Then I heard something that made my skin crawl. A voice from inside my room. "He's awake." I spun around, but saw no one. The voice had come from the closet. The closet door was slightly open. I knew I hadn't opened it. A hand emerged from the darkness inside, pale and thin with too many fingers. Then a face peeked out, human-shaped but wrong. The features were blurred like melted wax. "We've been waiting for you," it said. Its voice sounded like multiple people talking. More hands appeared from the closet. Too many hands for one person. I backed against the door. Outside, the rattling started again. I was trapped between them. That's when I noticed the bathroom door opening. Another figure crawled out from there, moving on all fours like an animal, but wearing human clothes. "Join us," they all said together, their voices overlapping into one horrible sound. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the lamp and threw it at the window. The glass shattered loudly. I didn't hesitate, just jumped through. I hit the pavement hard, but got up running. Behind me, I heard them following. Not running, but walking in perfect unison. Their footsteps sounded like a drum beat. I reached my car and fumbled for the keys. In the reflection of the window, I saw them. Dozens of them now, all walking toward me, all with those melted, wrong faces. I got in and started the engine. As I drove away, they just stood there watching. Not angry, not upset, just watching. I drove for hours without stopping. When the sun came up, I finally pulled over. I looked up the motel online. There was no record of it existing. The highway exit I had taken wasn't on any map. I drove back during daylight to check. There was nothing there but empty desert. No motel, no parking lot, no signs. Like it had never existed at all. I still have scars from jumping through that window. They remind me it was real. That somewhere out there is a motel that shouldn't exist, with guests that aren't quite human, waiting for tired travelers in the night. If you ever drive long distances, be careful where you stop. Some places only exist when you're vulnerable, and some rooms already have guests. Guests that have been waiting just for you. The school basement. My name is Tyler, and I'm 21 years old. This happened when I was in middle school. I was only 13, but I remember every detail. Our school was old, built in the 1920s. It had this huge basement that was mostly off-limits. Only janitors and maintenance people went down there, but kids always dared each other to sneak down. It became like a rite of passage. My friends and I had always been too scared, until the day Kevin called us chickens. He said we were babies for being afraid. That pushed us over the edge. Me, Jake, and Marcus decided to prove him wrong. We would go down after school when it was empty. We waited until most teachers had left. Then we slipped through the door marked "Staff Only." The stairs down were narrow and dark. Our footsteps echoed off concrete walls. The basement was bigger than we expected. Long hallways branched off in different directions. Pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping occasionally. The air smelled like mold and something else. Something sweet and rotten. We explored for about 10 minutes, finding old classrooms filled with broken desks. Storage rooms packed with dusty boxes. Nothing scary, just old and forgotten. We were starting to feel brave. That's when Marcus found the door. It was different from the others. Metal instead of wood, with a small window at eye level. The window was covered from the inside with newspaper. "Dare you to open it," Jake whispered. Marcus reached for the handle and turned it. The door opened with a long squeal. Inside was complete darkness. Our phone lights barely penetrated it. The smell hit us immediately, like roadkill mixed with chemicals. We covered our noses and stepped inside. The room was larger than it looked. Our lights revealed metal tables along the walls, like the kind you see in science labs. But these had leather straps attached to them. Dark stains covered the metal surfaces. "What is this place?" Marcus asked. His voice shook slightly. That's when we heard it. A wet breathing sound from the corner. We all froze and pointed our lights there. Something moved in the shadows. Something that had been very still. "Run," Jake said simply. But our feet wouldn't move. The thing in the corner stood up slowly. It was tall, hitting its head on the pipes. In our shaking lights, we saw glimpses. Pale skin stretched too tight, arms that bent in too many places, a face that used to be human. It spoke in a voice like grinding glass. "Students, not allowed. Down here." Each word seemed to cause it pain. It took a step toward us. Its movement was jerky, unnatural, like a broken puppet on strings. That broke our paralysis. We ran faster than we'd ever run before. Behind us, we heard it following. Its footsteps were wet and heavy, and it was laughing, a sound like choking on water. We hit the stairs and climbed 3 at a time. The door at the top was locked. We pounded on it, screaming for help. The wet footsteps were getting closer, coming up the stairs. Just when we thought we were trapped, the door opened. Mr. Patterson, the night janitor, stood there. His face went white when he saw us, and even whiter when he heard the sounds below. "Get out," he said, pushing us through. "Get out and don't come back." He slammed the door and locked it. We heard him sliding something heavy against it. We ran out of the school and didn't stop. The next day, we were called to the principal's office. Mr. Patterson was there, looking tired and old. The principal was furious about us breaking rules. But Mr. Patterson interrupted her. "These boys learned their lesson," he said firmly. "They won't go down there again. Will you, boys?" We shook our heads quickly. He leaned in close before we left. "Some doors are locked for a reason," he whispered. "That thing down there, it used to be a student. Back in 1953, there was an incident. The school covered it up. Now it lives down there, and we keep it fed. Animals mostly. Sometimes other things. You boys were lucky I heard you. Very, very lucky. We never went near that door again. But sometimes, during quiet moments in class, we could hear it. Sounds from below the school. Wet breathing and shuffling steps. The teachers always turned up the volume on their lessons, pretending they couldn't hear it too. I'm in college now, far from that school, but I looked it up recently. In 1953, a student named Thomas White disappeared. The official story was he ran away. But I know the truth. Thomas White never left that school. He's still there, in the basement, changed into something horrible, waiting in that dark room. If you're ever in an old building, Respect the locked doors. Some things are meant to stay hidden, and some students never graduate. They just become something else. Something hungry in the dark. The woods behind our house. My name is Rachel, and I'm 26 years old. This happened when I was 15, living with my family. We had just moved to a house in rural Maine. The house backed up to deep, thick woods. My parents loved the privacy and nature. I loved it too, at first. There were trails to explore and streams to follow. I spent hours out there after school. It felt like my own private kingdom. My parents just told me to be back by dark. They didn't know what lived in those woods. None of us did, until it was too late. It started with small things going missing. Garden tools, trash can lids, random stuff. Dad blamed it on raccoons or teenagers. Then our dog Max disappeared. He was a big German shepherd, not easily scared. One night he ran into the woods barking. We never saw him again. We searched for days, but found nothing. Not even his collar. Mom said he probably got lost chasing deer. But I heard sounds at night that made me wonder. Strange calls that didn't match any animal I knew. Like someone trying to imitate a dog's bark, but getting it slightly wrong. 2 weeks after Max vanished, I saw it. I was reading on our back deck after school. The sun was setting, painting everything orange. Movement at the tree line caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a person, someone tall walking between the trees. But the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, moving too smoothly. It stopped at the edge of our yard, just standing there, watching our house. I couldn't make out details in the shadows, but I felt its eyes on me. I ran inside and locked the door. When I looked back, it was gone. I told my parents, but they didn't believe me. Said it was probably just a hiker. But hikers don't move like that. And hikers don't watch houses. That night, I heard Max barking outside. His distinctive deep bark. I almost ran outside, so happy he was home. But something stopped me. The bark was coming from the woods. And Max never barked from just one spot. He always ran around while barking. This sound stayed perfectly still, like a recording being played. I peeked out my window toward the sound. In the moonlight, I saw the tall figure again. It was the source of the barking. The sound was coming from it, but its mouth wasn't moving. The barking just emanated from its body, getting Max's voice exactly right. I watched in horror as it moved closer, still barking in Max's voice. It knew we would recognize that sound. It was trying to lure us outside. I woke my parents and dragged them to the window. But by then, it was gone. The barking had stopped. They said I was having nightmares about Max. The next day, I found proof. Tracks in the mud by our garden. Not human footprints, but close. Too long, with too many joints. Like someone had stretched a foot to twice its length. Dad finally believed something was wrong. He called the police, but they were no help. Said it was probably a bear walking upright. But bears don't imitate dog barks. And bears don't watch houses for hours. We started staying inside after dark. Dad bought better locks and security lights. For a week, everything was quiet. Then came the night it tried to get in. I woke to scratching sounds at my window. Long, deliberate scratches on the glass. In the security light, I saw fingers. Impossibly long fingers with black nails. Scratching patterns on my window. almost like it was writing something. I screamed and my parents rushed in. The fingers withdrew into the darkness, but the scratches remained on the glass, symbols that hurt to look at. We moved out the next month. Didn't even pack everything, just left. The house sat empty for years after. Every family that moved in left quickly, all reporting the same things. Missing pets, strange barking sounds, scratched windows, and something tall watching from the woods. I live in the city now, surrounded by buildings and people and lights. But sometimes I have nightmares, dreams where I hear Max barking outside, and I almost open the door. If you ever live near deep woods, be careful. Pay attention when pets go missing, and never, ever go outside when you hear familiar sounds, because some things in the forest learn. They learn what sounds will make you open the door. Story 10. The Last Customer. My name is Alex, and I'm 29 years old. For 3 years, I worked the night shift at a 24-hour diner. It was on a lonely stretch of highway in Nevada, the kind of place truckers and travelers stopped at. Usually, the night shift was boring. Maybe 10 customers between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. I'd clean, restock, and watch TV. Easy money for a college student. But there was one customer I'll never forget. He started coming in about 6 months into my job. Always arrived at exactly 3:33 a.m. Always sat in the same corner booth. He was an older man, maybe 60s. Wore the same brown suit every time. Never saw him arrive in a car. He just appeared when I wasn't looking. His order never changed either. Black coffee and apple pie. He'd sit there for exactly 1 hour. Never less, never more. At first, I tried making conversation, but he only gave short, strange answers. When I asked his name, he said, "I've forgotten." When I asked where he was from, he said, "Nowhere now." His voice was dry like dead leaves. After a while, I stopped trying to talk, just served his order and left him alone. But I noticed things about him. His reflection in the window was wrong. It moved a second after he did, like it was trying to keep up. And his shadow fell the wrong way, always toward the light instead of away. The other waitress, Maria, refused to serve him. She said he made her feel empty inside. I thought she was being dramatic. Until the night everything changed. It was a Tuesday in October. Dead quiet except for the highway sounds. He came in at 3:33 as always. Sat in his booth, ordered the usual. But this time he spoke more. "Do you know what this place used to be?" he asked. I said no, it had always been a diner. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Before the diner, there was nothing here. Just desert and a crossroads. People used to die at this crossroads. Car accidents, murders, suicides. The ground here is soaked with endings. I felt cold despite the heater running. He continued, stirring his coffee. "That's why I come here, to remember what I lost, to feel close to it again." I asked what he had lost. He looked directly at me for the first time. His eyes were completely black. No whites, no iris, just black. "Everything," he said simply. The lights in the diner flickered. The TV turned to static. The temperature dropped 20 degrees. I backed away from his booth. That's when I noticed the other customers. People I hadn't heard come in. They sat at different tables, all silent, all wearing old-fashioned clothes, all with those same black eyes. "We've been waiting," the man said. "This place calls to us. The forgotten, the lost, the ended. We come here to remember being alive." More people appeared in the booths. The diner was filling with these things, all of them staring at me. "Join us," they said in unison. "You've served us long enough. Time to sit down. Time to rest." I ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. The windows showed only darkness outside. No highway, no lights, nothing. The man stood up from his booth. He moved wrong, like film played backward. "Don't fight it," he said. "Everyone stops eventually. Everyone reaches their last mile." I grabbed a knife from the kitchen. Not that it would help against these things, but holding it made me feel better. They surrounded me slowly. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like puppets on broken strings. That's when my phone alarm went off. 4:33 a.m. Time to prep for morning shift. The sound seemed to break whatever spell they had. The lights came back on. The TV returned to normal, and they were gone. All of them vanished in an instant. Only the man in the brown suit remained. He was back in his booth, coffee cold. "Not today then," he said sadly, "but soon. We're patient. The road always ends somewhere." He stood and walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned back. "Stop working nights," he said. "Find somewhere full of life. Otherwise, you'll end up like us, forever serving coffee to the dead." Then he was gone. I quit that job the same day. Didn't even finish my shift. The owner called me a dozen times, but I never went back. I looked up the history of that location. Dozens of deaths over the decades. Car crashes, murders, unexplained disappearances. All within a mile of that crossroads. The diner closed 6 months later. The new night shift worker had disappeared. They found his car, but never found him. I think I know where he is. Sitting in a booth at 3:33 a.m. in a diner that exists between worlds, serving coffee to things that used to be human. If you ever work night shift somewhere isolated, be careful. Pay attention to customers who come too regularly. And never, ever serve anyone whose shadow falls the wrong way. Because some customers aren't really there for the food. They're there for you. The collection. My name is Lisa, and I'm 35 years old. I'm a journalist who collects these stories. Real stories from real people. Each one verified as much as possible. I've spent 10 years tracking down witnesses, following up on old police reports, visiting the places where these things happened. And I've learned something terrifying. These aren't isolated incidents. There's a pattern to them. The same descriptions appear again and again. Different states, different years, but connected. The tall figures watching from distances. The things that mimic human voices. The places that exist only at certain times. The people who aren't quite people anymore. I've mapped out the locations. They form lines across the country, following old roads and forgotten paths. Places where the boundary is thin, where things can cross over. And it's getting worse. More sightings every year. More disappearances that don't make sense. More stories that people are afraid to tell. I've interviewed hundreds of witnesses. Most don't want their real names used. They're afraid of being called crazy. Or worse, afraid of being found again. Because that's the thing about these encounters. They change you. Once you've seen what's really out there, You can't unsee it. You check locks obsessively. You avoid certain places. You listen differently to night sounds. And sometimes you see them again. Just glimpses in your peripheral vision. Shadows that move independently. Figures in crowds that don't belong. Like they're checking on you. Making sure you remember. Making sure you're still afraid. I've seen them too, while investigating. A face in a window that shouldn't be there. Footprints that end in impossible places. Voices calling from empty rooms. They know I'm collecting these stories, and I think they want me to, because fear spreads like a disease. The more people who know, the more who believe. And belief gives them power, makes them stronger, more real. So why do I keep collecting? Because people need to know the truth. They need to be warned. They need to understand what's out there. These things have always existed, in the spaces between what we know, in the darkness we don't look at, in the sounds we pretend not to hear. But they're getting bolder, coming closer to our normal world, testing boundaries that used to hold. If you've had an encounter, you're not alone. Thousands of people have seen these things, have survived to tell about it, have learned to live with the knowledge. But more importantly, be careful. Lock your doors and windows. Trust your instincts about people and places. Don't investigate strange sounds alone. And never, ever follow something into the dark. Because not everyone who sees them survives. Not everyone gets to tell their story. Some become part of the darkness. Some become the next story someone else tells. Stay safe out there. The world is stranger than you know. And it's getting stranger every day. The Night Shift Security Guard horror story. I am 35 years old now, and this happened about 8 years ago when I was working as a security guard. I was desperate for money back then, so I took this job at an old office building downtown. The building was maybe 60 years old, with long dark hallways and flickering lights that never seemed to work properly. My shift started at midnight and ended at 8 in the morning. Most nights were quiet, just me walking around with my flashlight, checking doors and making sure everything was locked up tight. The building had 12 floors, and I had to check each one every 2 hours. One night in October, around 3 in the morning, I was doing my usual rounds on the 7th floor. The elevator was broken that week, so I had to take the stairs everywhere. As I walked down the hallway, checking each office door, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of typing. Someone was typing on a keyboard, and it was coming from office 712 at the end of the hall. The problem was, this building was supposed to be completely empty. No one worked night shifts here, and I had the only key to get inside. I stood there in the dark hallway, listening to the steady tap-tap-tap of fingers hitting keys. My heart started beating faster, and my hands began to shake. I pulled out my flashlight and slowly walked toward office 712. The typing stopped as soon as I got close to the door. I pressed my ear against the wood and listened carefully. Nothing. Complete silence. I tried the door handle, but it was locked, just like it should be. I used my master key to open the door and stepped inside the office. My flashlight beam swept across the room, showing empty desks and turned off computers. Everything looked normal, but something felt very wrong. The air was cold, much colder than the rest of the building. As I was about to leave, I heard the typing start again, but this time it was coming from right behind me. I spun around and shined my light on the desk closest to the door. The computer screen was on, and words were appearing on it, one letter at a time. "Get out now," appeared on the screen in big white letters. Then the computer turned off by itself, and the room went completely dark. My flashlight had somehow stopped working. I ran out of that office as fast as I could, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached the lobby on the first floor. I sat there for the rest of my shift, refusing to go back upstairs. When the morning shift arrived, I told my supervisor what happened. He just laughed and said the old building played tricks on people sometimes. But I knew what I saw, and I knew what I heard. I quit that job the next week. I found out later that a man had died in office 712 about 10 years before I started working there. He was found at his desk one morning, slumped over his keyboard. The doctors said it was a heart attack, but the security footage showed him typing frantically all night long, even though his computer was turned off. I still get chills thinking about that night. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed in that office longer. I'm glad I ran when I did. The babysitter's nightmare horror story. I was 17 years old when this happened, and I'm 24 now. I was babysitting for this family in a nice neighborhood, watching their 2 kids while the parents went out for their anniversary dinner. The kids were pretty easy to take care of. A 6-year-old girl named Emma and her 4-year-old brother Jake. The house was big and fancy, with a long driveway and tall trees all around it. It was the kind of place where rich people lived, and I felt lucky to get the babysitting job because they paid really well. Everything was going fine at first. I made the kids dinner, helped them with a puzzle, and then put on a movie for them to watch. Around 8 o'clock, I put Jake to bed in his room upstairs, and Emma wanted to stay up a little longer to finish watching her cartoon. At about 9:30, Emma was getting sleepy, so I carried her upstairs to her bedroom. As I was tucking her into bed, she looked at me with wide, scared eyes and said something that made my stomach drop. "The man in the closet says he likes to watch us sleep," she whispered to me. "He comes out when Mommy and Daddy are gone." I thought she was just having a bad dream or making up stories like kids do sometimes. I checked her closet, showed her it was empty, and told her there was no man there. She seemed to feel better after that, and she fell asleep pretty quickly. I went back downstairs to clean up the living room and wait for the parents to come home. They said they would be back by 11, so I had about an hour to kill. I was sitting on the couch, watching TV and checking my phone, when I heard footsteps upstairs. At first, I thought one of the kids had gotten up to use the bathroom, but the footsteps were too heavy, too slow. They sounded like an adult walking around up there. My heart started racing as I listened to the sound moving from room to room. I grabbed the house phone and crept up the stairs as quietly as I could. I checked Jake's room first. He was fast asleep in his bed, breathing softly. Then I looked in Emma's room. She was also sleeping peacefully, but her closet door was wide open. I was sure I had closed that closet door when I tucked her in. My hands were shaking as I walked over to close it again. As I reached for the door handle, I heard a voice whisper from inside the closet. "She's such a pretty little girl," the voice said. It was a man's voice, rough and creepy. "They both are." I stumbled backward and almost screamed, but I caught myself. I didn't want to wake up the kids and scare them. Instead, I ran downstairs as fast and as quietly as I could, grabbed my phone, and called 911. While I was on the phone with the police, I heard the footsteps again. This time they were coming down the stairs. I hid in the kitchen and watched through the doorway as a tall, thin man walked past the living room. He was wearing dark clothes and had greasy hair. He looked exactly like the kind of person you would cross the street to avoid. The man walked straight to the front door and let himself out, like he owned the place. He didn't even look around to see if anyone was watching him. A few minutes later, the police arrived, and then the parents came home right after that. The police searched the whole house and found that the man had been hiding in Emma's closet, probably for hours. He had somehow gotten in through a basement window that wasn't locked properly. They found candy wrappers and empty water bottles in the closet, which meant he had been coming into the house regularly. The scariest part was when the police officer told me that this man was a known predator who had been watching the family for weeks. He knew their schedule, knew when they went out, and knew that they hired babysitters. They caught him 2 days later trying to break into another house in the neighborhood. He's in prison now, but I still think about what could have happened that night. What if I hadn't believed Emma when she told me about the man in the closet? What if I had just ignored the footsteps? I never babysat again after that night. Even now, I always check my closets before I go to sleep, and I make sure all my doors and windows are locked tight. The gas station attendant horror story. This happened when I was 22 years old, about 6 years ago. I was working the night shift at a gas station on the edge of town, right where the city meets the highway. It wasn't the safest job in the world, but I needed the money, and the pay was decent for overnight work. Most nights were pretty quiet. Truck drivers would stop for coffee and gas, and sometimes drunk people would come in for snacks on their way home from bars. I was used to dealing with all kinds of people, and I thought I had seen everything. The gas station was one of those old-style places with big windows all around, so you could see out into the parking lot from anywhere inside. There were only 2 gas pumps outside, and a small convenience store where I worked behind the counter. One night in late November, around 2 in the morning, this old pickup truck pulled up to pump number 1. I could see the driver through the window as he got out of his truck. He was a big guy with a baseball cap pulled down low over his face. Nothing unusual about that. Lots of people dressed that way. He started pumping his gas, but then he just stood there for a really long time, even after the pump had stopped. He was facing away from the store, looking out toward the dark fields beyond the parking lot. I figured he was just tired, or maybe talking on his phone. After about 10 minutes, he finally came into the store to pay for his gas. He walked up to the counter and put a $20 bill down without saying a word. When I looked at his face, I felt something cold crawl up my spine. His eyes were completely black. Not just dark brown or dark blue, but black like a shark's eyes. And he was smiling this weird smile that didn't look right on his face. It was too wide, and it showed too many teeth. "Just the gas," he said in a voice that sounded like gravel. He kept staring at me with those black eyes, and I felt like he was looking right through me. I gave him his change and tried to act normal, but my hands were shaking. He took the money and just stood there for a moment, still smiling that creepy smile. Then he leaned forward and spoke in a whisper that made my blood run cold. "I know where you live," he said. "Nice little apartment above the pizza place on Main Street. You leave your bedroom window open at night." My heart nearly stopped. I did live above the pizza place, and I did sometimes leave my window open when it got hot. But I had never seen this man before in my life. How could he possibly know that? He turned around and walked out of the store without another word. I watched him get in his truck and drive away slowly, like he had all the time in the world. As soon as he was gone, I locked the front door and called my manager. When I told him what happened, he said I should call the police. But what was I going to tell them? That a customer knew where I lived? That his eyes looked weird? They would think I was crazy. I spent the rest of my shift checking the locks on the doors and windows every few minutes. Every time a car drove by on the highway, I thought it might be the man in the pickup truck coming back. When my shift ended at 6 in the morning, I drove home as fast as I could. I parked behind the pizza place and ran up the stairs to my apartment. The first thing I did was check my bedroom window. It was closed and locked. just like I had left it. But when I looked at the fire escape outside my window, I saw something that made my stomach turn. There were wet footprints on the metal grating, and they led right up to my window. Someone had been standing there, looking into my bedroom. I called the police right away, and they came to check out the apartment. They found more footprints on the fire escape and some scratches around my window lock, like someone had been trying to get in. The officer who took my report said they would patrol the area more often, but they never found the man in the pickup truck. I moved out of that apartment the next week and quit my job at the gas station. 4 months after that, I was paranoid that he was still watching me. Every time I saw an old pickup truck, my heart would start racing. I still don't know how he knew where I lived or how long he had been watching me before that night. I never worked another night shift job again. Some people said I was overreacting, but I know what I saw in those black eyes. There was something very wrong with that man, and I'm just glad I never found out what he really wanted. The college dorm room horror story. I was 18 years old and just starting my freshman year of college when this happened. It was my first time living away from home, and I was both excited and nervous about being on my own. The college had assigned me to live in one of the older dorms on campus, a building that had been there for about 40 years. My roommate was a guy named Marcus who seemed pretty cool. He was from a small town about 3 hours away, and like me, he had never lived in a dorm before. We got along well and were both looking forward to starting classes and making new friends. Our room was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long hallway. It was pretty small, with 2 beds, 2 desks, and a tiny closet that we had to share. The walls were painted this ugly green color, and the carpet was old and stained. But it was ours, and we were proud of it. Everything was going fine for the first few weeks of school. Marcus and I had settled into a routine, and we were both doing well in our classes. The only weird thing about our room was that it got really cold at night, even when the heat was turned up high. One night in early October, I woke up around 3 in the morning because I heard whispering. At first, I thought it was Marcus talking in his sleep, but when I looked over at his bed, he was completely silent and still. The whispering was coming from somewhere else in the room. It sounded like 2 people having a conversation, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. The voices were too quiet and too muffled. I lay there in my bed, listening carefully and trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, like the voices were inside the room with us, but somehow hidden. After about 10 minutes, the whispering stopped, and the room went completely silent again. I convinced myself that I had been dreaming, or that it was just sounds from other rooms traveling through the thin walls. But the next night, it happened again. Same time, same quiet whispers that I couldn't understand. This time, I got up quietly and walked around the room, trying to locate the source of the voices. The sound seemed to be strongest near the closet. I didn't want to wake up Marcus, so I didn't turn on the lights. I just stood there in the dark, listening to the mysterious conversation happening somewhere inside our room. The voices went on for about 15 minutes before they stopped. On the 3rd night, Marcus woke up too. He sat up in his bed and looked around the room with a confused expression on his face. "Do you hear that?" he whispered to me. "Yeah," I whispered back. "It's been happening for 3 nights now." We both got up and searched the room together. We checked inside the closet, under the beds, and even looked out in the hallway. But we couldn't find anything that would explain the voices. The whispering continued for about a week, always at the same time, always coming from the same area near the closet. We started losing sleep and getting really stressed out about it. We thought about asking for a different room, but we didn't want people to think we were crazy. Finally, we decided to talk to our resident advisor about it. His name was Tom. and he was a senior who had been living in the dorms for 3 years. When we told him about the voices, his face went pale. "You guys are in room 314, right?" he asked us. "Yeah, why?" Marcus said. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then he told us something that made our blood run cold. 2 years before we moved in, there had been a murder-suicide in our room. A student had killed his roommate and then himself. They had been arguing about money, and the fight had escalated until it turned violent. The weird thing was, Tom said, the police found evidence that they had been fighting for weeks before it happened. The neighbors complained about hearing arguments coming from that room almost every night. Marcus and I looked at each other, and I felt sick to my stomach. We were hearing the echoes of those final arguments, the voices of 2 dead students who had died in the very room where we were trying to sleep. We moved out of room 314 the next day. The housing office gave us a new room in a different building without asking too many questions. Tom had apparently told them about our situation, and they understood why we wanted to leave. I found out later that room 314 had been empty for most of the time since the murder-suicide. A few students had tried to live there, but they all moved out within a week or 2. The college eventually stopped assigning students to that room. I finished my freshman year in the new dorm, and I never heard those voices again. But sometimes, when I walk past the old building on my way to class, I look up at the 3rd floor and wonder if the whispering is still happening in room 314. I'm a senior now, and I've heard that the college is planning to renovate that old dorm next summer. Maybe that will finally put those voices to rest. Or maybe it will just make them angry. The Night Jogger horror story. I am 28 years old now, and this happened about 3 years ago when I was living in a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town. I had gotten into the habit of jogging late at night because my work schedule was so crazy during the day. I was a nurse at the local hospital, and I often worked 12-hour shifts that ended around 11 at night. The apartment complex had a nice walking trail that wound through some woods behind the buildings. It was about 2 miles long, and it had small lights along the path so people could use it after dark. I loved jogging on that trail because it was peaceful and quiet, and it helped me wind down after stressful days at work. Most nights, I had the trail completely to myself. Occasionally, I would see another jogger or someone walking their dog, but usually, it was just me and the sounds of the woods. I felt safe because the trail was well lit and close to the apartment buildings. One night in September, I was about halfway through my usual route when I noticed someone else on the trail behind me. I could hear footsteps that seemed to be matching my pace exactly. When I sped up, the footsteps sped up. When I slowed down, they slowed down too. At first, I thought it was just another jogger who happened to be running at the same speed as me. But when I looked over my shoulder, I couldn't see anyone there. The trail behind me was empty, but I could still hear the footsteps clear as day. I stopped completely and turned around to get a better look. The footsteps stopped too, and the trail was silent. I stood there for about a minute, looking back down the path, but I didn't see or hear anything unusual. I started jogging again, and within a few seconds, the footsteps were back. Same rhythm, same distance behind me. This time, I was getting scared. I picked up my pace and headed for the nearest exit from the trail. But as I got closer to the apartment buildings, the footsteps started getting closer too. I could hear them right behind me now, so close that I should have been able to turn around and see whoever was following me. I spun around quickly, and for just a split second, I saw something that made my heart nearly stop. There was a figure standing about 10 feet behind me on the trail. It looked like a person, but something was very wrong with it. The figure was completely black, like a shadow, but it was three-dimensional and solid-looking. It didn't have any features that I could make out, no face or clothes or anything like that. It was just a human-shaped darkness standing on the trail. I blinked, and it was gone. The trail behind me was empty again, and everything was quiet. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. I ran as fast as I could back to my apartment and locked the door behind me. I told myself that I had been seeing things, that I was just tired from working too many long shifts. But deep down, I knew that what I had seen was real. The shadow figure had been following me, matching my footsteps, staying just out of sight. I didn't go jogging on that trail for about 2 weeks. When I finally worked up the courage to try again, the same thing happened. Footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer, and then the brief glimpse of that dark figure before it disappeared. After the third time, I stopped using the trail altogether. I started driving to a gym across town to do my cardio workouts instead. It was more expensive and less convenient, but at least I felt safe. A few months later, I was talking to one of my neighbors, an older woman who had lived in the complex for about 10 years. I mentioned that I used to jog on the trail, but had stopped because it felt creepy at night. She got this strange look on her face and asked me if I had ever seen anything unusual back there. When I told her about the shadow figure, she nodded like she wasn't surprised at all. "You're not the first person to see that thing," she said. "About 5 years ago, a young man was attacked on that trail. Someone beat him up real bad and left him for dead. He died on his way to the hospital." She told me that several people had reported seeing a dark figure on the trail since then, always at night, always following joggers and walkers. The apartment management had added more lights and increased security patrols, but the sightings continued. "Most people just avoid the trail after dark now," she said. "It's not worth the risk." I moved out of that apartment complex about 6 months later for reasons that had nothing to do with the trail. But sometimes I still think about that shadow figure and wonder if it's still out there, following other late-night joggers through the woods. I've never told this story to anyone except that neighbor, and now you. Most people would think I was making it up, or that I was hallucinating from stress. But I know what I saw, and I know that it was real. I still jog at night sometimes, but only on busy streets with lots of lights and traffic. I'll never go running on an isolated trail again, no matter how safe it's supposed to be. The grocery store night stalker horror story. I was 21 years old when this happened, working the night shift at a big grocery store to pay for college. The store was open 24 hours a day, but after midnight, it was mostly just employees restocking shelves and a few customers who worked late shifts or had insomnia. My job was to unload trucks and put products on the shelves in the back section of the store. This included things like canned goods, cereal, and other packaged foods. The work was pretty easy, but it got lonely working by myself in those long aisles while most of the world was sleeping. The store was huge, with high ceilings and long fluorescent lights that hummed constantly. At night, they would turn off about half of the lights to save electricity, so some aisles were pretty dark. The produce section and the meat department were completely closed off with metal gates. I had been working there for about 3 months when I started noticing strange things happening during my shifts. Items would fall off shelves for no reason, usually in aisles where I wasn't working. I would hear the crash of cans or bottles hitting the floor, but when I went to clean up the mess, everything would be normal. The other night shift workers said the store was probably just settling, that old buildings made weird noises and sometimes caused things to fall. I tried to believe that explanation, but the incidents were happening too often to be coincidental. One night in December, I was working alone in aisle 12, stocking soup cans, when I heard footsteps at the other end of the aisle. I looked up and saw a woman walking slowly toward me, pushing a shopping cart. She was wearing a long, dark coat and had grey hair that hung down over her face. She moved very slowly, like she was having trouble walking, and her cart was making a squeaking sound that echoed through the store. "Excuse me," I called out to her. "Do you need help finding anything?" She didn't answer or even look up at me. She just kept pushing her cart down the aisle, getting closer and closer. As she passed under one of the working lights, I got a better look at her face, and I immediately wished I hadn't. Her skin was pale and waxy looking, like she was seriously ill. Her eyes were completely white, with no pupils or color at all, and her mouth was hanging open in a way that didn't look natural. I stood there frozen as she pushed her cart right past me without acknowledging my presence. She smelled like something rotten, like food that had been left out too long. The smell was so strong that it made my stomach turn. I watched her continue down the aisle and turn the corner into the next section of the store. I could still hear her cart squeaking as she moved through the aisles, getting farther and farther away. I tried to get back to work, but I couldn't concentrate. The image of that woman's white eyes and pale skin was stuck in my head. I kept listening for the sound of her cart, but after a few minutes, the store went completely quiet again. About an hour later, I was working in a different aisle when I saw her again. This time, she was at the far end of the store, near the pharmacy section. She was just standing there with her cart, not moving, facing in my direction. Even though she was probably 100 feet away, I could feel her staring at me with those horrible white eyes. I tried to ignore her and focus on my work, but every time I looked up, she was still there, just watching me. This went on for about 20 minutes. Then, suddenly, she started pushing her cart toward me again. She moved faster this time, and the squeaking sound was getting louder and more urgent. I didn't want to be anywhere near her when she reached my aisle, so I grabbed my box cutter and walked quickly toward the front of the store where the other employees were working. I told my supervisor that there was a customer acting strange and that maybe someone should check on her. My supervisor, a guy named Dave, said he would go take a look. I waited near the customer service desk while he walked back through the store to find the woman. He was gone for about 10 minutes, and when he came back, he had a confused expression on his face. "I didn't see any woman with a cart," he said. "I checked every aisle, even the ones that are closed off. The store is empty except for us." I insisted that I had seen her twice, that she had been pushing a cart and wearing a dark coat. But Dave just shrugged and said that maybe I was tired and seeing things. For the rest of my shift, I stayed close to the other employees and avoided working alone in the back aisles. I kept expecting to see that woman again, but she never reappeared. The next night, I asked the other night shift workers if they had ever seen a strange woman shopping late at night. One of the older guys, who had been working there for about 5 years, got this serious look on his face. "Was she pale, with white eyes?" he asked me. "Yeah," I said. "How did you know?" He told me that several employees had seen the same woman over the years, always late at night, always pushing a cart but never actually buying anything. She would appear in different sections of the store, watch the employees work, and then vanish without a trace. "The weird thing is," he said, "there's no record of her ever entering or leaving the store. The security cameras never pick her up, and the automatic doors don't open for her." He said that most of the night shift workers had learned to just ignore her when she appeared. She never caused any trouble or tried to interact with anyone. She would just watch for a while and then disappear. I worked at that store for another 6 months, and I saw the woman probably a dozen more times. I never got used to it, and I never stopped being scared when she showed up. But I followed the advice of the other workers and just tried to pretend she wasn't there. I eventually found a different job with day hours, partly because I was tired of going to school during the day and working all night. But mostly, I left because I couldn't handle seeing that ghostly woman anymore. I still shop at that store sometimes during normal hours, and it looks completely different in the daylight. It's bright and busy and full of regular people doing their grocery shopping. It's hard to believe that the same place becomes so creepy and haunted at night. But sometimes, when I'm walking through the aisles, I listen carefully for the sound of a squeaking cart. So far, I haven't heard it during the day. I hope I never do. The late night Uber driver horror story. I am 31 years old now, and this happened about 4 years ago when I was driving for Uber to make some extra money. I had a regular day job at an insurance office, but the pay wasn't great, so I would drive people around on weekends and late nights to help pay the bills. Most of my rides were pretty normal. I would pick up people from bars, take them home from work, or drive them to the airport. The passengers were usually friendly, and I enjoyed meeting different people and hearing their stories. I had been driving for Uber for about 6 months when I got a ride request that changed everything. It was a Saturday night around 2:30 in the morning, and I was getting ready to head home when the app pinged with a new ride. The pickup location was in a part of town I didn't know very well. It was an older neighborhood with small houses and narrow streets. Most of the streetlights were broken or dim, and there weren't many cars parked on the road. When I pulled up to the address, I saw a woman standing on the sidewalk waiting for me. She was probably in her 40s, with long dark hair and a black jacket. She looked normal enough, but something about her made me feel uneasy right away. She got into the back seat without saying hello or even looking at me. When I asked her to confirm her destination, she just gave me an address on the other side of town. Her voice was very quiet, almost like she was whispering. As we started driving, I tried to make small talk like I usually did with passengers. I asked her how her night was going and if she had been out somewhere fun. But she didn't answer any of my questions. She just sat in the back seat, staring out the window. About 10 minutes into the ride, I glanced in my rearview mirror to check on her, and what I saw made my blood run cold. She was staring directly at me through the mirror, and her eyes looked completely black. Not dark brown or dark blue, but solid black like holes in her face. I tried to convince myself that it was just the lighting in the car, or maybe she was wearing colored contacts. But when I looked again a few minutes later, those black eyes were still staring at me. She hadn't blinked or looked away even once. "Are you feeling okay back there?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't answer, but she started smiling. It was the most disturbing smile I had ever seen, too wide and showing too many teeth. She looked like a predator that had just cornered its prey. I started driving faster, wanting to get this ride over with as quickly as possible. But then she did something that made me consider pulling over and telling her to get out. She started laughing, but it wasn't a normal laugh. It sounded like several different voices laughing at the same time. The laughter went on for about 2 minutes, and then it stopped abruptly. The car went completely silent except for the sound of the engine and the tires on the road. I was too scared to look in the mirror again, so I just focused on driving and tried to ignore her. When we finally reached her destination, I pulled up in front of a house that looked abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the yard was overgrown with weeds, and there was a "for sale" sign that looked like it had been there for years. "This doesn't look like anyone lives here," I said, turning around to face her. But the back seat was empty. She was gone. The door hadn't opened. I hadn't heard her get out, but she had completely disappeared. I checked the floor, thinking maybe she had fallen or hidden somehow, but there was no sign of her anywhere in the car. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to figure out what had just happened. Then I noticed something that made my hands start shaking. The passenger door handle on the inside was covered in what looked like black handprints, like she had been grabbing at it with hands covered in oil or paint. I drove home as fast as I could and spent the next hour cleaning those black marks off my car. But no matter how hard I scrubbed, I couldn't get them completely clean. There were still faint traces of the handprints visible on the door handle. The next day, I looked up the address where I had dropped her off. According to the county records, the house had been empty for over 3 years. The previous owner had died in the house, and the family had been trying to sell it ever since, but no one wanted to buy it. I also checked my Uber app to see if there was any record of the ride, but according to the app, I hadn't given anyone a ride that night. There was no trip history, no payment record, and no way to contact the passenger. I kept driving for Uber for a few more weeks, but I was always nervous about picking up passengers late at night. Every time someone got in my car, I would check their eyes in the rearview mirror to make sure they looked normal. Finally, I decided it wasn't worth the stress and the fear. I stopped driving for Uber and found a second job working at a restaurant during the day. The pay wasn't as good, but at least I felt safe. I still think about that woman sometimes, especially when I'm driving alone at night. I wonder who or what she really was, and why she got into my car that night. I'm just glad that she disappeared when she did, because I have a feeling that ride could have ended much worse. The hospital night nurse horror story. I was 25 years old when this happened, working as a night nurse at a small hospital in my hometown. I had just graduated from nursing school a few months earlier, and this was my first real job in the medical field. I was excited but also nervous about working in a hospital, especially during the night shift when things could get unpredictable. The hospital where I worked was pretty old, built sometime in the 1960s. It had that typical hospital smell of disinfectant and floor wax, and the fluorescent lights buzzed constantly in the hallways. During the day, it was busy and full of life, but at night, it became quiet and almost eerie. My floor was the medical unit, where we took care of patients with various illnesses and conditions. Most of them were elderly people who needed monitoring and medication throughout the night. It was usually peaceful work, just checking on patients and updating their charts. I had been working there for about 2 months when I started noticing something strange. Every night around 3:15 in the morning, I would hear the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the nurses' station. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone walking carefully so they wouldn't wake up the patients. At first, I thought it was one of the other nurses or maybe a doctor making rounds. But whenever I looked out into the hallway, it was always empty. The sound would stop as soon as I stood up from my desk, and the hallway would be completely silent. This went on for about a week before I mentioned it to Sandra, one of the other night nurses who had been working at the hospital for over 10 years. She got this strange look on her face when I described what I had been hearing. "Room 314, she said quietly. "That's where the footsteps are coming from, isn't it?" I hadn't really thought about which direction the sound was coming from, but now that she mentioned it, room 314 was right down the hall from the nurses' station. It was a private room at the end of the corridor. "What's special about room 314? I asked her. Sandra looked around to make sure no one else was listening. Then she told me something that made my stomach drop. About 5 years earlier, a patient in room 314 had gotten up in the middle of the night and walked down to the nurses' station. He was confused and disoriented, probably because of his medication. The patient had collapsed right in front of the nurse's desk and died of a heart attack before anyone could help him. The strange thing was that he had been on bed rest and wasn't supposed to be walking around at all. The doctors never figured out how he had managed to get out of bed and walk down the hallway. Ever since then, Sandra said, nurses on the night shift have been hearing footsteps at the same time he died. 3:15 in the morning. Always coming from room 314. Always stopping at the nurses' station. I felt chills run down my spine as she told me this story. The timing was exactly right, and the location matched what I had been experiencing. But I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, or maybe the building settling. The next night, I paid closer attention when 3:15 came around. I was sitting at the nurses' station, updating patient charts on the computer, when I heard the familiar sound of footsteps beginning at the far end of the hallway. This time, I didn't get up from my chair. I just sat very still and listened as the footsteps came closer and closer. They were definitely coming from the direction of room 314, and they sounded like someone wearing hospital slippers shuffling across the linoleum floor. The footsteps stopped right in front of the nurse's station, exactly where Sandra had said the patient had collapsed years earlier. I could feel a presence standing there, like someone was watching me, but when I looked up from my computer, there was nothing there. After about 30 seconds, I heard a soft thud, like something heavy falling to the floor. Then everything went silent, and the strange feeling of being watched disappeared. This same thing happened every night for the next 2 weeks. Always at 3:15, always the same pattern of footsteps ending at the nurse's station, followed by the sound of something falling. I started dreading that time of night and would find excuses to be somewhere else on the floor when it happened. One night, I decided I had to see what was actually happening. I positioned myself in a chair where I could see the entire hallway, and I waited for 3:15 to arrive. When I heard the footsteps begin, I watched the empty hallway carefully. What I saw will stay with me for the rest of my life. There was a translucent figure moving down the hallway toward me. It looked like an elderly man in a hospital gown, walking slowly and carefully like he was having trouble with his balance. As he got closer, I could see that his face was pale and drawn, like he was in pain or very tired. His eyes were focused on the nurse's station, like he was trying to reach something important there. When he reached the spot in front of my desk, he looked directly at me for just a moment. His eyes were sad and confused, like he didn't understand what was happening to him. Then he collapsed, just like Sandra had described, and disappeared completely. I sat there for several minutes, shaking and trying to process what I had just witnessed. I had seen a ghost, a real ghost, and there was no way to explain it away or pretend it hadn't happened. The next day, I asked to be transferred to the day shift. I told my supervisor that the night schedule wasn't working well with my sleep patterns, which wasn't entirely untrue. She approved the transfer, and I started working days the following week. I never experienced anything supernatural during my day shifts. The hospital felt completely normal during regular hours, busy and full of living people. But sometimes, when I had to stay late for overtime, I would make sure to leave before 3 in the morning. I worked at that hospital for 3 more years before taking a job at a newer facility across town. I never told anyone except Sandra about what I had seen that night. Most people would think I was crazy or making it up. But I know what I saw, and I know that some part of that elderly patient is still walking the halls of that hospital, trying to reach the nurse's station for help that will never come. The movie theater projectionist horror story. This happened when I was 19 years old, working as a projectionist at an old movie theater in the downtown area of my city. The theater had been built in the 1940s and still used the old-style film projectors instead of the digital systems that most theaters have now. My job was to operate the projectors during evening shows and to clean and maintain the equipment after the theater closed. It was pretty good work for a college student, and I enjoyed being able to watch movies for free during my shifts. The theater had 2 screens, which meant I had to run back and forth between 2 projection booths to change reels and keep the movies running smoothly. The projection booths were small, cramped rooms above the theaters, connected by a narrow hallway that ran along the back of the building. Most nights, I worked alone after the other employees went home. The manager would lock up the main part of the theater, but I had my own key to the projection area so I could finish my work and let myself out through the back entrance. I had been working there for about 4 months when I started noticing strange things happening during my late shifts. Equipment would be moved around when I wasn't looking. Film canisters would fall off shelves for no apparent reason, and sometimes I would hear voices coming from the empty theaters below. At first, I thought maybe the building was just old and creaky, or that sounds from the street were carrying into the theater somehow. But the incidents were becoming more frequent and more difficult to explain away. One night in October, I was in projection booth number 2, rewinding a film that had just finished showing. It was around 11:30, and the theater had been closed to customers for about an hour. I was alone in the building, or at least I thought I was. As I was working with a film reel, I heard the sound of applause coming from the theater below me. It sounded like a full audience clapping at the end of a movie, but I knew the theater was completely empty. I looked through the small window in the booth that allowed me to see the screen and the seating area. The lights were off, and I couldn't see anyone in the seats. But the applause continued for about 30 seconds before it gradually faded away. I told myself that it must have been a sound from outside, maybe from a restaurant or bar nearby where people were having a good time. But deep down, I knew that the applause had definitely been coming from inside the theater. A few nights later, something even stranger happened. I was in projection booth number 1, cleaning the lens on the projector, when I heard the sound of the projector in booth number 2 starting up. The motor was running, and I could hear the familiar clicking sound of film running through the machine. But I knew I hadn't started that projector. I had been in booth number 1 for the past hour, and booth number 2 was supposed to be shut down for the night. I walked over to the other booth to see what was happening. When I opened the door to booth number 2, the projector was indeed running. There was a film loaded in the machine, and light was shining down onto the screen below. But there wasn't supposed to be any film in that projector, and I certainly hadn't put one there. I looked at the film as it ran through the machine, trying to figure out what movie it was, but the images on the film didn't make sense. It looked like footage of the theater itself, but from a time when it looked different. The seats were a different color, and the decorations on the walls were not the same as they were now. In the film, I could see people sitting in the theater, watching a movie. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, like something from the 1950s or 60s. The audience looked happy and engaged, laughing and reacting to whatever they were watching on the screen. But here's the thing that really freaked me out. As I watched this mysterious film, one of the people in the audience turned around and looked directly up at the projection booth. It was an elderly man with grey hair and glasses, and he was staring right at me through the camera. He smiled and waved, like he could actually see me watching him. Then he pointed to the empty seat next to him, as if he was inviting me to come down and join the audience. I immediately shut off the projector and removed the film from the machine. But when I examined the film reel, it was completely blank. There were no images on it at all, just clear plastic film that had never been exposed. I spent the rest of my shift in booth number 1, avoiding booth number 2 completely. Every few minutes, I would hear sounds coming from the other booth, like someone was moving around in there. But I was too scared to go check. When my shift ended, I locked up the projection area and went home as quickly as possible. I didn't sleep well that night, and I kept thinking about the man in the film who had waved at me. The next day, I did some research about the history of the theater. I found out that it had been much more popular in the 1950s and 60s, when it showed first-run movies and attracted large audiences every night. I also discovered that the theater's previous projectionist, a man named Harold, had died of a heart attack in booth number 2 in 1973. He had been found the next morning by the cleaning crew, slumped over the projector he had been working on. When I saw a picture of Harold in an old newspaper article about his death, my blood ran cold. He was the same man I had seen in the mysterious film, the one who had waved at me and pointed to the empty seat. I quit my job at the theater the following week. I told the manager that I had found a better opportunity elsewhere, which wasn't exactly true. I just couldn't handle working in that building anymore, knowing that Harold was still there, still running films for an audience that existed only in the past. The theater closed down permanently about 2 years later. The building was demolished to make room for a parking lot. I sometimes wonder if Harold and his ghostly audience finally found peace when their theater was torn down, or if they're still somewhere, watching movies that no living person will ever see. The 24-hour laundromat horror story. I was 23 years old and living in a cheap apartment that didn't have a washer and dryer when this happened. There was a 24-hour laundromat about 3 blocks from my place, and I would usually go there late at night when it wasn't crowded and I could get my laundry done quickly. The laundromat was in a strip mall between a closed-down video store and a Chinese restaurant that was only open during the day. At night, it was the only business in the plaza that had its lights on, which made it feel isolated and a little creepy. But the laundromat itself seemed safe enough. It was well lit, with big windows that let you see in from the parking lot. There were about 20 washing machines and 15 dryers, along with some plastic chairs where you could sit while you waited for your clothes. I had been going there for about 6 months without any problems. Usually, there would be 1 or 2 other people doing their laundry, but sometimes I had the whole place to myself. The owner had installed security cameras and an alarm system, so I felt reasonably safe even when I was alone. One night in November, I went to the laundromat around midnight with 2 loads of dirty clothes. When I arrived, there was only one other customer there, an older woman who was folding clothes at one of the tables near the front of the store. I loaded my clothes into 2 washing machines and bought some detergent from the vending machine. As I was putting quarters into the machines, I noticed that the older woman was watching me. Every time I looked in her direction, she would quickly look away, but I could feel her staring at me. After I got my clothes started, I sat down in one of the plastic chairs and pulled out my phone to pass the time. The woman finished folding her laundry and left, which meant I was alone in the laundromat. I was used to this, so it didn't bother me at first. But about 10 minutes after the woman left, I started hearing strange sounds coming from the back of the laundromat. It sounded like one of the dryers was running, but making a weird thumping noise like there was something heavy tumbling around inside it. I got up to investigate and walked toward the back row of dryers. The sound was definitely coming from dryer number 12, which was at the far end of the row. But when I looked at the control panel, the dryer wasn't turned on. The timer was set to 0, and there was no heat or movement inside the machine. As I stood there looking at the dryer, the thumping sound stopped. Everything went quiet except for the humming of my washing machines and the fluorescent lights overhead. I checked inside the dryer to see if someone had left clothes in there, but it was completely empty. I went back to my chair and tried to ignore what had happened, but about 15 minutes later, the thumping started again. This time, it was coming from a different dryer, number 8, which was closer to where I was sitting. Again, when I went to check on it, the dryer appeared to be turned off and empty, but as I stood there, I could swear I heard something moving around inside it, like a heavy object rolling back and forth. This pattern continued for the next hour. Every few minutes, one of the dryers would start making the thumping sound, and when I went to investigate, it would stop and the machine would appear to be off. It was like something was playing a game with me, trying to get my attention. When my washing was done, I moved my clothes to 2 dryers near the front of the laundromat, as far away from the problematic machines as possible. But even then, I could hear the thumping sounds continuing in the back row. As my clothes were drying, a man came into the laundromat with a basket of laundry. He was probably in his 40s, wearing a work uniform like he had just gotten off a late shift somewhere. He seemed normal enough, and I was relieved to have some company. But as soon as he started loading his clothes into a washing machine, all the thumping sounds stopped. The laundromat went completely quiet except for the normal sounds of the machines that were actually running. The man and I made small talk while we waited for our laundry. He mentioned that he had been coming to this laundromat for about 2 years and had never had any problems with the equipment. When I asked him if he had ever heard strange noises from the dryers, he gave me a puzzled look. "What kind of noises?" he asked. I described the thumping sounds I had been hearing, but he just shrugged and said he had never experienced anything like that. He seemed to think I was imagining things, or that maybe one of the machines was just having mechanical problems. When my clothes finished drying, I folded them quickly and got ready to leave. As I was gathering my things, the man's washing machine finished its cycle, and he went to move his clothes to a dryer. He chose dryer number 12, the same one where I had first heard the thumping sounds. As soon as he closed the door and started the machine, I heard the most horrifying sound I had ever heard in my life. It wasn't thumping anymore. It was screaming. A human voice, muffled by the metal walls of the dryer, screaming in terror and pain. The man couldn't hear it because he had walked back to his chair and was looking at his phone, but I could hear it clear as day. I ran over to the dryer and tried to open the door, but it was locked automatically because the machine was running. The screaming continued for about 30 seconds, and then it stopped abruptly. The dryer continued running normally, tumbling the man's clothes as if nothing had happened. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't tell the man what I had heard because he would think I was crazy, and I couldn't call the police because what would I tell them? That I heard screaming coming from a dryer that was working perfectly fine? I left the laundromat as fast as I could, without saying goodbye to the man or explaining why I was leaving so suddenly. I drove home with my hands shaking and my heart pounding. The next day, I looked up the history of the strip mall where the laundromat was located. I found out that about 10 years earlier, there had been an accident at the laundromat. A homeless man had broken in during the night and had somehow gotten trapped inside one of the dryers. He wasn't found until the next morning, and by then it was too late. The newspaper article said that the man had probably been trying to stay warm and had climbed into the dryer, not realizing how dangerous it was. The dryer had turned on automatically when the door closed, and he couldn't get out. I never went back to that laundromat. I found a different one across town, even though it was more expensive and less convenient. Sometimes I drive past the old strip mall, and I can see people inside the laundromat doing their laundry like nothing ever happened. But I know that something terrible is still trapped in those machines, and I pray that no one else will ever hear what I heard that night. The apartment building maintenance man horror story. I was 26 years old when I took a job as a maintenance man for a large apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. The complex had been built in the 1980s and had about 200 units spread across 12 buildings. It was my job to fix broken appliances, unclog drains, and handle other repair requests from the tenants. Most of the work was pretty straightforward, and I enjoyed being able to help people solve their problems around their homes. The pay was decent, and I got a small apartment in the complex as part of my compensation, which helped me save money on rent. The apartment complex was generally a nice place to live and work. The tenants were mostly young professionals and small families, and everyone was friendly and respectful. The buildings were well maintained, and the management company invested in keeping everything in good repair. But there was one building, building number 7, that always gave me an uneasy feeling. It was identical to all the other buildings in the complex, but something about it felt different. The hallways seemed darker, the air felt colder, and tenants in that building seemed to have more problems with their apartments than anywhere else. I had been working at the complex for about 3 months when I got my first maintenance request from Building 7. A woman in apartment 7B called to say that her kitchen sink was backing up and wouldn't drain properly. When I arrived at her apartment, she seemed nervous and kept looking over her shoulder while she showed me the problem. The sink was indeed clogged, but as I was working on it, she started telling me about other issues she had been having. "The lights flicker all the time," she said, "and sometimes I hear footsteps in the apartment above me, even though I know it's empty." I told her that old buildings sometimes had electrical issues and that sounds could carry between units in unexpected ways. But as I worked on her sink, I started noticing some of the things she was talking about. The lights in her kitchen did flicker occasionally, even though there didn't seem to be any problem with the wiring, and I could hear what sounded like someone walking around upstairs, even though I knew that apartment 7C had been vacant for several weeks. After I finished fixing the sink, I decided to check on the empty apartment upstairs to see if there might be a water leak or some other issue that could explain the sounds. I used my master key to enter apartment 7C and immediately felt like something was wrong. The apartment was supposed to be empty, but it felt like someone was living there. There was a strange smell in the air, like old food or unwashed clothes, and even though the electricity had been turned off, I could swear I saw shadows moving in the corners of the rooms. I did a quick inspection of the apartment and didn't find any obvious problems with the plumbing or electrical systems. But as I was about to leave, I heard the sound of footsteps coming from the bedroom. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone pacing back and forth. I called out, thinking maybe a homeless person had somehow gotten into the apartment. "Hello? Is someone there?" But the footsteps stopped immediately, and the apartment went completely silent. I searched the bedroom and the rest of the apartment thoroughly, but I didn't find any sign that anyone had been there. All the windows were locked from the inside, and I was the only one with a key to the front door. Over the next few weeks, I got several more maintenance requests from Building 7. Tenants complained about strange noises, electrical problems, and mysterious odors. Every time I went to that building, I felt increasingly uncomfortable. The worst incident happened about a month later. I got a call from a man in apartment 7A who said his toilet was overflowing and flooding his bathroom. When I arrived, I found him standing outside his apartment in the hallway, looking pale and shaken. "I can't go back in there," he told me. "Something's not right about that place." He explained that while he was trying to fix the toilet himself, he had heard voices coming from the walls. Not voices from neighboring apartments, but voices that seemed to be coming from inside the walls of his own bathroom. I went into his apartment to assess the situation, and I immediately understood what he meant. As I worked on the toilet, I could hear what sounded like multiple people having a conversation somewhere behind the bathroom wall. The voices were muffled, but they sounded urgent and distressed. I knew there was no plumbing or electrical access behind that particular wall, and the building plans showed that it was just a standard interior wall with insulation. There was no logical explanation for voices to be coming from that location. As I finished fixing the toilet, the voices became louder and more distinct. I could make out individual words and phrases, and what I heard made my blood run cold. The voices were talking about being trapped, about not being able to get out, about needing help. I left that apartment as quickly as possible and told the tenant that the toilet was fixed. But I couldn't stop thinking about those voices and what they might mean. That night, I did some research about the history of the apartment complex. I found out that during the construction of Building 7 in 1986, there had been an accident. A section of the building had collapsed while workers were inside, and 3 construction workers had been killed. According to the newspaper reports, the workers had been trapped in the rubble for several hours before rescue crews could reach them. The building had been completed despite the accident, but I wondered if something of those workers had remained trapped in the structure. I continued working at the apartment complex for another 6 months, but I tried to avoid Building 7 as much as possible. When I had to do repairs there, I worked as quickly as I could and left immediately afterward. Eventually, I found a different job at a newer apartment complex across town. The pay wasn't as good, and I had to find my own place to live, but I felt much safer and more comfortable in my new work environment. I heard from a friend who still lived at the old complex that Building 7 was eventually demolished and replaced with a parking lot. Apparently, too many tenants had complained about strange occurrences, and the management company decided it was easier to tear it down than to keep dealing with the problems. I hope that demolishing the building finally allowed those trapped workers to find peace. But sometimes, when I'm working on plumbing or electrical issues in other buildings, I listen carefully to make sure I don't hear any voices coming from the walls.